why don't we begin now that you're in Austin, Texas, and we're face to face? Introduce yourself to anybody that's listening and watching.
All right. Hello, I'm Casey Mayers, and I've been a data center power geek for over a quarter of a century now, 25 years. And a long history working with a lot of the hyperscalers and hyperscale providers and providing power solutions around the globe.
You got it. And when we were like kind of chatting in the back scene, I was like, I'm trying to remember. Normally when I'm driving to a place, if there's someone I'm doing a podcast with, because I do it with people I've never met before, which is great. But sometimes when you are doing it with people you've known for a few years, it's better. I've known of you and we've known each other. We've known each other for, I remember there was a project in Austin, I think that some consultants hired you to come in and take a look at a facility back in the early days, and you were like, what are you guys trying to do with this building in Pflugerville or something like that? It was something like that. Do you remember those days?
I do remember that.
And that's when we met for the first time, because we were kind of hired as the construction experts and you were the data center. Like, is that campus good for this land? What can you do on this land? What were the capabilities and limitations of power, things. And that was, I remember that, like, have you ever heard of this guy named Casey? I'm like, I think most of the industry know who Casey is, because you said you worked for some of the big companies. I think, where did you start at? Were you Yahoo in the beginning?
I actually started, really, if we even take a step further back, it was really Sun Microsystems at the time in the 1990s, when Sun Microsystems was really the leading technology company at that time. And of course, building the hardware that went into data centers, predominantly most of the hardware that went into data centers.
D. Nelson.
That's right. D. Nelson came from there, along with, Mark Monroe and a lot of other, I would say, really kind of key people from the data, that ultimately went into the data center industry. And I really helped to really kind of start building out our data centers and labs, our internal data centers and labs.
Sun?
Sun Microsystems. That was in the late 90s. And at that time, I was part of what we called the major energy users group. And it was really all the big technology companies in Silicon Valley. So it was HP and IBM. And at the time, we didn't have Google and Yahoo, and those companies weren't really around. But obviously, there was a couple of data center companies, and I became the leader of that group, which was all these big energy users group. And we ultimately we kind of saw the writing on the wall that California was going to have a power crisis, right, forthcoming. And we started banging that drum about a year before, and ultimately, I got hired by Exodus Communications, which of them, right?
Yes.
That was really kind of the start.
Explain who they were. They were the genesis of this industry. Them
Without
and
a doubt.
Savvis, right? And there's how many talented people, I always talk about how Digital Realty Trust has populated more C-suites in this industry than any other company, right? And maybe I'm wrong, but I'd say, it depends on the month or maybe, the quarter, you could challenge me, but there's a lot of former digital alumni. But if you look back on the enterprise, the enterprise side, most of those people came from the Exodus and Savvis days, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Look at Kava
at that time,
Furlong.
Exodus Communications provided over a third of the world's internet traffic through its data centers, right? We had over 60 data centers in the year 2000 around the globe. I think it was 65, right? But you think about that. In the year 2000, for one company to have 65 data centers around the globe was phenomenal. That's right. And I remember the CEO tasking me with, I want to say it was about a $1.5 billion CapEx spend over 6 months. We were only we were an $850 million a year revenue company at the time.
Still massive at the time.
But that's right, very big for that time. And obviously big spends, everything else. And we were building these data centers that were 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 megawatts each, which that was really big for that time again. And the company hired me to solve the power problem, because all these utilities balked every time that we came to a town, whether it's Frankfurt or Berlin or London, wherever it was, right, Dublin, and we'd say we want 10 plus megawatts. They would say no way.
They would say no, you don't need it, or no, you can't have it, or no, you're not going to use it.
They would question that we even ever needed that.
Yeah.
Right. That was step number one that I had to work through. So I had to work up these really close relationships with the utilities to really help them understand that we were legitimate business, we were real, right, and this load was real and it was growing, and that we ultimately did need that, because otherwise they were just questioning it. They didn't want to spend the capital to build out, transmission lines and substations, and of course generation assets behind all that to support a load that was never going to materialize, right? So there was a lot of challenges with that, and also at the time, a 10 megawatt load was a really big load, right? At that time, it was either a paper mill, an aluminum smelter, a steel mill, and maybe like a big oil refinery or some other petrochemical kind of industrial processes, right? Like other than that, nobody had loads of that size.
Right.
And here we are again now 25 plus years later, and we're in the same boat, but now data centers are starting to actually even I would say, trump or lead, right? Even some of those other industries in really total capacity. Yeah, it's going to be great. So I know it's a kind of a long-winded answer to your question.
This is what I wanted.
But really, is Exodus Communications that really got me started in the data center industry, and I loved it. It was fascinating.
Exodus started a lot of people's industries.
Tom Furlong, who went on to lead data centers at Facebook or Meta, ultimately, and he and I did a lot of work together over the early years when he was at Meta. But obviously, we all ultimately worked later on at Yahoo as well together. And anyways, just another example. But there's a lot of people that really established that, and I have some really close relationships with those people that I still. I can show up at their house anytime.
Yeah,
right. When I'm traveling into their city, I can just show up, and we're always just going to have dinner.
I love it.
Right, it's fantastic, and I know their kids, and now I feel like know some of the grandkids. Yeah. Right, it's really been fun.
This industry has been like that. I mean, this is you said the late '80s or late '90s, and everyone refers to it like that. But I'm like, little history here. I think you and I talked about this once. The first data center ever built was built for and funded by the U.S. government for national defense and intelligence in 1945. But the first commercial one was 1953, and it was with for American Airlines for the efficiency of booking more seats. Look how far we've come. I've heard arguments where some people are like, the internet, this industry's data center, like the mainstream industry that we are dealing with today, didn't really start until Amazon.com took flight in 1994. And I don't know if that's true either, but I do know that everyone else I talk to that really talks about where the momentum came and the shift began was in the late 1990s, not the mid or
That's
earlies.
Right. Yeah.
And then we had the dot-com bust, which ended the third industrial revolution ended in that dot-com bust. And what was the industry like then? Because it took a wholesale model and then it broke it down into a retail model. I mean, how did you see the industry kind of shift?
Yeah, I would say it was the other way around. Like Exodus Communications, we sold by the rack. Right.
Oh,
and
you did.
That was for the most part it. Although I remember like Visa and Yahoo and Google were customers of ours, and they would take entire rooms or big caged areas,
dedicated suites,
right? And even like I remember Visa, we had to build it even hard walls because of their security requirements, and stuff like that. Put steel mesh in the walls and stuff. So they did have those kinds of customers, but those were. Even though they were wells at the time, they were not the typical business model. And there wasn't any differentiation between really the big, call it, build to suit, kind of data center customer to the rack per rack customer. They were all in the same room, right? It was just a matter of they were separated by cages or walls or something of that nature. So ultimately later on, right, that got a little more bifurcated. Digital Realty focused on, when they started in 2004, they really started more of the wholesale. And I would say they were probably really kind of if not the leader, the starter of the wholesale data center market.
I agree.
Yeah, and because before then, it was really like AT&T and the other Mobels and Exodus Communications and a few.
Was Equinix there? Was Telex there?
Equinix didn't start up until a few years later. I don't remember exactly the year, but I want to say it was like 2002 or 3, something of that nature, right? I think it was right before Digital Realty. It might have been 2001. And at the time, like when I was at Exodus Communications, we made an acquisition offer to buy Global Center, Global Center was an offshoot of Global Switch, which was their really data center division. We ended up buying them, but it was really what ultimately, one of the things that ultimately tanked Exodus Communication. It wasn't so much the dot-com boom as it was that here we are, this $850 million a year revenue company. We're buying another company that's like a $500 or $600 million revenue company. And obviously the integration of those two did not go well. There was a lot of kind of, internal egos. Yeah. And it was really too big of a pill for Exodus to really swallow at that time. And at that time, everybody was like, go bigger, go bigger, go bigger, right? Yeah. It's like, go big or go home. And so the money was driving it. And Ellen Hancock, who was our CEO, was really, driven to do those M&As, something she did at IBM where she had come from. But ultimately, it just became too big. We did several acquisitions in a row and that one really kind of just ended up being too big. And we took on a lot of debt burden and got really probably too stretched, right? With too many projects going on simultaneously. And then, of course, you have sales teams who are saying, oh, yeah, we're forecasting, 50% growth per quarter, things like that. And eventually it can't hold.
It's untenable. Yeah, you can't scale.
Pets.com can't keep growing at 50%,
Isn't that crazy?
Which at the time were the kind of business that were growing like that. And so if Exodus just kind of was a little more austere for just a couple more years, we would have made it through a dot-com, boom, bust, and then really came out of it like where Equinix and Digital Realty, where they manifested and ultimately turned into very big, successful businesses, right? The two biggest data center providers globally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you, at the time, were you living in Silicon Valley?
Yeah. I was.
Is that where you're from? Like, where are you from? I know your dad's a former Marine, wasn't he?
Yeah, he is a former Marine. He was a career Marine. So yeah, we moved around a lot, you know. So like when someone asks where I'm from, it's a really long-winded
Military
answer.
brats have the hardest time saying that. I'm one too.
Yeah, exactly. So, you know, everywhere from, I would say like after I was born, the key place, my dad was after Vietnam, he was an instructor. He was at tactical fighter weapons school, right?
Okay.
So Top Gun at the time, right?
Sure.
Or what's now become known as Top Gun. But he was an instructor there for several years. So at that time, that was I believe it was in South Carolina, North Carolina, Florida. I can't even remember because we spent some time in that area. And then ultimately became a base commander for both El Toro Marine Corps Air Station and then also Camp Pendleton. He was the XO of Camp Pendleton. And that was really fun because by that time I was old enough I could go out on a Hummer with him and watch these, you know, practice wars going on where he had planes and tanks and you know, mortars and infantry, and it was like all this stuff going on. And even, you know, the ships shooting from the sea, right? You know, your days of being on the Navy, it was really fascinating to watch and see that. But he ultimately became we lived in DC for a while as well because he became really like the CFO for the Marine Corps, and then ultimately reported to Congress and the White House on really all the military budgets and new weapons programs.
Sure.
And so the Marine Corps was very kind. They paid for multiple graduate degrees. And so, you know, he was able to advance, you know, pretty well with those through the Marine Corps. But I really kind of think of my home as being Santa Cruz, which is this little bastion of kind of idealism and you know, south of the Bay Area on the ocean, right? Where it's just everything, no one locks their doors, everyone knows everybody. You don't really pay any bill because you know people at every kind of restaurant or movie store, movie place or whatever, or you just hold a tab. Yeah. And it was a really nice place to grow up, really close, great friendships there. I still have very close friendships from there. And you could kind of run around and explore both the oceans and the mountains and the redwoods. But ultimately, I loved going back to the Bay Area after college, right? And I was really happy about that. And so, I lived right in the Bay Area. I lived, you know, in Palo Alto, right in the heart
of all this when it first started.
Absolutely. Right? And I loved it. It was great because all my neighbors were working for tech companies. They were lawyers or doctors or working for a tech company.
Sure.
And so we all went out to dinner every night and we got to know each other and, you know, and who's doing what and what's going on in the Valley and all these companies coming up. And it was really fascinating because I remember Google, you know, was like interviewing me and I was telling a couple, just this whatever little tech company, you know.
Oh, you remember those days?
Yeah, I remember those days. So it was still 1,000 employees at that time, right?
Still.
They were in 2 buildings. That was it. Yeah, they were still really tiny. And I'm like, I don't know. Who knows what they're ever going to become.
Were you at Yahoo at the time? Where were you?
No, I went to Yahoo after Google. I'm trying to remember now, going a little back in hindsight. After Access Communications. So Janice Fetzer, who was my manager at Access Communications, really ran all data center development, engineering, construction, all of that. And she was really, I would say, an integral part of starting that whole industry. And like, how do you create leases? How do you like create the construction, you know, budgets and planning and, you know, forward planning for all the engineering of, you know, density changes and all this. Anyways, when she left Exodus, she was like, come start this data center company with me. And she had a house in Truckee, California, which was a lot of people in the Bay Area obviously have a vacation home there. She had a vacation home there, a second home. And she was like, we're going to base out of Reno because that's where the investors are. And I'm like, Reno? Like, why would I ever go to Reno? Right? I mean, I go to Truckee all the time. Yeah, I would go to Truckee all the time to go skiing and mountain biking and stuff like that. But I'm like, you know, Reno's only really a half an hour down the hill. A lot of people don't recognize that, right? And
I didn't know that.
Yeah. And so I thought long and hard about it. And I thought, you know, why not? This is a pretty interesting opportunity to go start a data center company. And so we started that company. And then about 3 years later, we sold it off. And that was a really interesting experience to be able to start and build really a data center company. And that company was focused on the tier 2 cities, which today are becoming much more common.
Primaries, yeah.
Back then, there was still, you know, it was all about the NFL cities. Yeah, exactly.
I get it. That's where the hub and spoke of the backbone of fiber throughout the country are at. It made more sense.
But at the same time, you know, you think about the NFL cities, it's 12 of the top 100 cities. you still have the other, 88
A lot
cities,
of eyeballs
right?
out there to still catch, Yeah, I got you. I'm
Yeah.
with you. So, and you guys did your data center though in Truckee, or was
We did one in Reno, right? And then we did another one in Raleigh, North Carolina.
Raleigh,
right? And that was it. We just had this like kind of bi-coastal sort of setup.
What was
there.
the genesis of those locations? Was it power driven back in those days? Was it
Reno was driven because that's where the investors were. We had some very, wealthy, private equity that was based there that wanted to invest in sort of this new technology. And when Janice started kind of hanging out in Reno, she was recognizing that Reno was in the doldrums. It was in the 1980s. It had lost its luster as the gaming town.
the new Vegas.
Right. And yeah, it's right. Vegas obviously had stole that away a long time ago. And, the days of Sammy Davis Jr. and
Frank Sinatra.
Frank Sinatra, that's right. The whole Rat Pack, they lived there, right?
Yeah.
And they literally lived there because they were performing there all the time. Well, that was long over. And Reno was still a bunch of old boys network trying to hold on to a dilapidating downtown of old casinos, right? And a few key people, one Senator Reed was one of them, but also a few other key people, in the state were like, we need to focus on new industries, right? And that was technology. And so I was at a conference with a few governors or the governor of Nevada at the time, he was just governor of Nevada at the time, Harry Reid, who was a senator at the time, and also, of course, the speaker of the Senate, the leader of the Senate at the time. And Jeff Bezos came into town because he was going to open up Amazon's first warehouse in that market.
Okay.
And I was speaking there. And so I got to go toward Jeff of our data center there in town, which is really kind of fascinating to have this hour with Jeff,
That'd be cool.
Yeah. It was back when I seriously was like, Amazon, their bookseller. Like in business school, I created a business model, and I made a joke to Jeff. I'm like, hey, you kind of stole my business. And of course he kind of got a little alarmed, and I'm like, whoa, but like I created this business model in business school about how I think we really need to make bookstores this internet-based thing. And this was back in the early 90s.
Sure.
And so it was a long time before, and the internet was still very nascent, and you had to get in this terminal to actually type a message and stuff like that. And I just saw like, I think there's a better way of doing business here. And so I made this joke with him about it, and anyways, we laughed about it and stuff. But I really was a little surprised that Amazon was like going into rakes and lawn equipment and, tools and all this other stuff that now it is
everything.
The shopping store.
Yeah,
you have
like
everything.
Tom Segura has a piece on. He's like, you could get a eagle's beak, you could get sardine, like you could name whatever you want, and Amazon's like,
it's remarkable.
It's right there. Yeah, it is incredible. The statistics. I was doing some research for the upcoming conference where I'm going to make a presentation on some of the things that happen in a data center minute, and it's amazing to understand. I think I didn't understand, but according to ChatGPT and all the AI platforms I'm getting, Amazon has an incredibly large volume of internet traffic relative to the rest of the world.
Yeah. I've seen some stats about it, and it's really
the stats
impressive.
that I was looking at. I was like, damn, I had no idea. I don't think a lot of people understood. They could literally sell everything. It seems like, so
without a doubt. So after we sold off Redundant Networks, a small little data center company, Google called me up and said, hey, we're looking to really start owning and operating our own data centers.
Interesting.
And so I was number 7 of the data center team to go and help start and really evaluate properties to buy or lease that were already existing.
Were
data
they global
centers.
challenge? Was it just domestic?
It was a global challenge. We did have data centers that we looked at in Eastern Europe. One of those, and Finland ultimately was one of those that came out of that in the Nordics. There was obviously some throughout other parts of Europe. There was a little bit in APAC, and ultimately some of that stuff kind of materialized. But really at the time, it was mostly focused in North America.
Not South America, though?
Not
like
South
not
America time,
Mexico.
other than like Brazil for like networking.
Yeah.
Which ultimately became the best networking hub for South America at the time.
Yeah.
Right. Mexico still was not an established data center market. That's been pretty recent.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And anyway, so I, helped them really establish their first data centers. And it was interesting because we bought these, in some cases, the old data centers I helped build at Exodus, 500,000 square foot
pennies on the
building in Lithia Springs, Georgia, right? Yeah. To now that Exodus only ended up building out one little portion of it. And now we're building out all 500,000 square feet and building out our own hardware manufacturing, right? Or assembly of the racks and stuff. So we could ship these racks to any of our data centers globally, right? Already pre-populated and all that stuff. And same thing on the return back to refresh them. So it was a really interesting business model in 2004 and 2005 for Google to be thinking about this. I'd say without a doubt, they were the first hyperscaler to think about building, owning, and operating their own data centers
that scale.
and actually doing it. Yeah. And at the time, you think about 1,000 employees, they were not necessarily cash rich, right? But Sergey and Larry really had that vision. And Ors, who was, head of engineering, this is such a key asset to our business. It's pivotal. And if a data center goes down, or if we can't get capacity, right, when and where we need it to grow, or if we want to also deploy new innovative technology that we don't want anybody else to see, which all those things were true, right? Or own the networks as much as we can, right? And start buying them, right, to our own data centers, which obviously you couldn't do that if you're in a co-location company. You had to, contract
the carriers.
Yeah, that's right. Now, dark fiber was still available then, but it wasn't as available or as common as it's become, right? And it wasn't so much like companies like Google buying an entire, line connecting data centers, right?
They were not yet.
I don't think it was happening just yet at that scale. It was just starting, right? At Exodus, we were selling dark fiber or contracting with the providers, the network providers, right, to provide us that and then work with our customers to do it. So it is happening at a little bit of a scale in that 2000, 2001 timeframe, but it was still pretty early. And it wasn't like we had big hyperscalers at the time.
The thing that was the biggest, I think I remember in the early 2000s, the thing that I remember being the longest pole in the tent was the reliability of the designs. It wasn't like, there would always be like, we'll just get you back to a carrier hotel or something, right? But it seemed like the product at that time was really heavily focused on reliability and now it seems to be based on speed to market and scalability. Back then it was like, were you building tier 4 in Exodus? Were you guys?
Yeah, that's right. And I'm not even certain. I think tier 4 was available. That was out then.
Yeah.
I think, that was all Uptime had already created those standards by then. And we were building to that standard. And we thought of ourselves as the leader on how we built reliability. And when I joined Exodus Communications, I was with, meeting, I worked alongside the engineering team and with them every day. And I sat in our design and development meetings where we're on how do we design our 6th generation now of data centers, all that. And I was like, guys, we really need to focus on energy efficiency and ultimately getting power capacity so we can scale faster and better. And in 2000, that was unheard of. And even Jay Park.
No one cared about the efficiency.
Nobody cared. And Jay Park was leading
Facebook.
I think it was electrical engineering at Exodus Communications at the time. It might have been mechanical or electrical. I think he was electrical, but I can't remember for sure now. But that's right. Then he did go on to Meta, and led engineering there of data centers, and did a great job with that. But I remember him saying, "No, Casey, it's all about reliability. It's not about power capacity or efficiency."
It was back then. Yeah,
it wasn't.
That was the product. Now it's not that at all.
And then you fast forward, several years, and of course, Christian Bellotti, created the PUE standard. We were all sitting around in rooms talking about how do we become more efficient? How do we measure this? Right? Christian was really good about that very simple measurement, metric, and we all started using it, and we all started kind of competing with each other for who could be more efficient.
Who could ride the most efficient data centers out there from the design, not just calculation, but the way that it's measured and metered, right? So
yeah,
I remember that. I remember reliability and was first, then the PUE allowed us to have more visibility into the efficiency of it. And then I think the third wave was really the scalability of it. Volume and velocity became the product because everyone was signing it to an SLA anyway.
And now that's accelerating to great scale and speed.
The speed is driving so fast that it's literally ripping out components of the electrical permutation that people are like, we'll just live without that. It could be engines, it could be UPSs, who knows where we're going to go. But this is a great conversation. I keep interrupting you because we're going to take it all the way to where we see the evolution of power, the efficiency demands that we're going to see from power, and then what we think. I believe that nuclear will be the thing that we pivot to at some point. But I would love to hear your thoughts on that statement, plus all the things that are going to happen between now and that happening in terms of bridging power or short-term solutions. When I say short-term, I mean over the next 5 to 6 years, but there's a lot of cool things that are coming. But the genesis of this is you started in this industry when the industry was starting, and even in the earliest days, you were already thinking about energy efficiency. When most people were looking at that as you weren't winning deals based on energy efficiency. You were winning deals based on reliability and speed to market back then.
Yeah, and priority lists in our customers, when we surveyed them, it was basically priority number 5 or something of that nature, right? It was, which once you're past the top 3, it didn't really matter.
Sure.
Right. But eventually, of course, it moved up to that top 3 and then, even top 1 for
now.
some period. Yeah. And To me, like efficiency should not cost more to build a more efficient data center. It should actually cost less. And I've worked on projects for NREL and for NCAR, National Center for Atmospheric Research, and I worked on a project for McGill University, and all those were based in the PUEs of 1.05, right? And that was back in that like 2009 through 2013 timeframe, right? So call it 10 to 15 years ago, right? PUEs of 1.05, nobody, annualized, right? Nobody had just everyone
calculated or really measured?
No, actually measured, right? And those are actual results that they're showing, and NREL's actually posted some of the results. But the reality is we couldn't, at that time, nobody would believe it. Nobody could believe like, no, there's no way you can get to 1.05. Because at the time it was like, okay, it's calculated.
Most
Let's
people were
build
at 3.5 when these calculations first came out.
Yeah, that's
people
right.
didn't know.
I remember like Uptime measuring that, and it was somewhere in that like above 3. And
yeah, it was ugly.
Yeah.
But no one knew.
Nobody knew. And Jonathan Kumi, who's been a longtime friend in this industry, he and I actually got together back when we had the California energy crisis, it was right around that time. Actually, I have a lot of memories and stories around that, and I could go into that. And the first report that went to Congress, ultimately, that came out of a kind of a conversation John and I had. And I've worked with him on many like metrics, but he ultimately, like, I remember he and I talking in like 2008 or 9 or 10, and him saying, yeah, we're at an average right now of 2.5, like based on the work he was doing with Uptime Institute and, through
the industry was at an average of that.
Yeah, that's right.
At least they were being honest. I mean, they were probably worse than that. People were over, but at the end of the day, I think our utilization of power was increasing with demand, but our efficiency at the same time, because of the PUE, made it more look like a flat line versus a down or an up. It just looked like it was at a plateau for a few years, where the reality is we were demanding more right around the same demand level of what we were able to solve for from an efficiency basis. Do you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. There was 2 things that happened. I think our PUEs basically stayed flat and didn't get worse or necessarily better because our power density increased. And because power density increased, we actually got better utilization of the data center, and therefore actually became more efficient, right? Mm-hmm. We didn't have all these systems that were just sitting around idle, yes, right? They were actually being utilized. And so that made it ultimately more efficient. And then also, of course, people started taking interest in the cost of power, right? As well as the availability of it. And I'm talking about the availability and capacity, not so much the reliability. But obviously, if you have systems that are inefficient, they're not going to be very reliable either. You have a UPS system that is very inefficient, it's likely you're going to start blowing capacitors and stuff like that in that UPS, right? Because it's struggling to run at a very low utilization, right? So you start thinking about these things and how do you make it better? And resisting years forward, but I worked on a couple of, it kind of gets back to one of your questions. I worked on a project for, at the time, Apple, and it was all about, we were like, hey, let's really ask the team about the applications that are going to the data center. Let's not ask them, what do you want built? Because they're always going to say tier 4. Yeah, that's it, right? Everyone just jumps to that conclusion, right? Oh, it's got to be reliable. You said, let's go ask the actual applications teams, what are you running in here? Right. And when you ask that, you realize, there's some applications in here that they don't even reliability, care. Yeah. But there's some that don't matter at all. Yeah. Right. They're like, if this thing shuts down for an hour every night, it doesn't really matter. Right. Yeah. Just doing some back end, whatever, crawling or other data, function or something, or a little backup function, like it could go down, it's fine. Right. And so we said, well, how about then we just get rid of your diesel gen sets, because what you're telling us is at this location where we're going to put this data center, it's so reliable. We're already going to have 4 nines availability just from the grid connection.
A gen would give you a fifth, right?
A gen will give you a fifth, but you don't need it, right? And then by the time you add your UPSs in there, you're already kind of pushing a 5 just because the grid, like its downtime, you're talking maybe 30 seconds at each outage because you're connected now with these high voltage transmission lines, right? 345 kV and stuff, those don't go down for long periods of time. Yeah. Or if they do, it's a really bad outage, but then everything's down anyways. Yeah. Right. And so the odds of an outage is just so small, and the length of it so, insignificant, that diesel gens are just irrelevant. By the time they start up, you're already back online again.
For some of those applications, I can see how that makes sense. If you're selling 100% uptime to an SLA, though, you don't care. You're going to get the engines and they're going to pay for it, right?
Yeah. We have this real disconnect in the industry between both our co-location providers and our hyperscale provide,
they
tenants.
What they build for themselves is not the same as what they rent.
That, and also even internally within the hyperscalers, we tend to always drive to a higher level of availability when we design and build a data center, what we expect from our operators to operate it at, than really what we need, right? And we have to really start thinking about what do the applications need. And I would say, I think Google and Meta actually were two that were very good at this and instrumental. If you look at Meta, like them looking at their cold storage, right? That was kind of a good first hyperscaler really evaluating this, saying, you know what? People aren't going to look at that video they took of their cat from 5 years ago, or they're not going to look at that photo they took of, a sunset from 5 years ago. So we can just dump that on
a cold site.
That's right. And exactly. In a cold site, it can be on a Blu-ray disc. And if you want to pull that photo up sometime, fine. You'll wait 10 seconds to get it.
It'll take 30 seconds.
That's right. No big deal, right? And if you can't access it, it's probably not going to really matter.
Yeah.
So I think I applaud those that have really try to look at that and try to, really, I'll call it bifurcate their availability need based on the application need, right? And trying to align those two. And so that way we're not just building at the highest availability.
One homogenous platform that was, you're building Ferraris when they just need F-150 type of things sometimes, right?
And we think about it, basically the electrical mechanical systems are 80% of the cost to build a data center, just rough order of magnitude, right? And 60% of that cost in building a data center is really the electrical systems. Mm-hmm. And so if we can cut out diesel gens and UPSs or some of that, right? Or some of that redundancy of those systems, the 2N and the mechanical systems, we dramatically reduce the cost to build that data center. And that's where I mean, efficiency can actually be lower cost if we really sit there and be pragmatic about it and say, what do we actually need? And let's break it down, those first principles of what are we trying to solve for, right? And align that to the application. And those supercomputing data centers I worked on that had those really high PUE, really low PUEs, high efficiency, right? 1.05 PUEs. Those are in 2010, 2009, those were 40 kW a rack. That was super high for the industry at the time, which was really averaging 5 to 8, right? Kilowatts a rack. And so we had really high density, but we also then had to make it really efficient, right? In order to make sure that we had the power capacity and we could cool it efficiently and all those other things. So we started doing direct liquid cooling and things like that, in combination with air cooling. And, that was fairly new for that time period, right? Now, of course, anything really over about 50 kW a rack, any kind of AI type of data center, of course, is going to be water cooled, and that's going to gain efficiencies. And some companies, some of the hyperscalers, I can't talk about some of those projects, but we've been working on some of those things for a long time now, 10 years. And it's really cool to see, those direct liquid cooling going back 10 plus years ago to these really high density applications that are already in that 50 to 80 kW a rack.
Were you seeing
10 years ago?
10 years ago?
Yeah.
In high performance compute environments for
high performance computing, supercomputes, but then also in some of the
enterprise
in hyperscale AI applications of that time.
10 years ago, they had those densities, huh? All right, were they I never saw those. Those must be
we're seeing 40 to 80, at that time.
Back those days. Yeah. So at what point, you've always been focused on the efficiency of power. Was the mechanical stuff something that you gave a shit about the most, or were you more focused on energy?
I would say I've been focused on really just power solutions. And of course, that means really getting power and using it efficiently and wisely. So it's the cost of it. I started as a renewable energy developer, right? And that was, one thing is I started out before I came even to the data center business.
Really?
But also I was really good at negotiating interconnection agreements and development of land, for at the time, renewable energy projects and things like that. But also, so those, that enabled me to really kind of do my business I had to do in the data center business of getting power, but then also how do you manage it wisely? Because it's hard to go to utility and say, hey, I want a 100 megawatt connection, but I'm going to waste it, right? And I say waste it, let's face it, almost every day we see an article about the data centers being power hogs. And that's a common term that's used, right, against our industry. And it really pains me to see that.
I hear you. Let's unpackage this, because let's bookend some of this stuff and let's really start talking about this, the misperceptions of power, the utilization of power, some of the trends of power. I know the numbers that I've seen have been staggering, right? And I know that you're more deeply involved in power than I am, right? But I'm exposed to, I read the Goldman report that talked about how we need 45 gigs in the next 5.5 years, and 60% or 27 gigs of that alone will be nat gas. Right. The rest will be a combination of 3 other things, 2 of those primaries being solar and wind. Right. So, and I think hydrogen or some sort of fuel cell option was probably the third. But what are you seeing in terms of this misconception of power in our industry? And what are some of the things that you think we need to right the way that I think that there's an old narrative out there that exists along the elements of power in this space. And I'm trying to reinvent that narrative.
Yeah. To me, I feel like we as an industry don't do a good job representing ourselves as a common interest, right? Each company can do that, fairly well on their own, but as a common interest, I think we do. And one of those things I think we need to do a better job of is when we speak about the industry is make people recognize that we're not power hogs. We're providing a service to you, the user.
A utility.
You're the one using that power, right? We're providing the service, that utility, that's right, to serve that online application that you're using, right? And if you don't use it, there's no power draw. And I don't want to say let's put the emphasis or onus, right, or responsibility on the end user, but we need to make them realize we're not just consuming a bunch of power for just the sake of consuming power, right? We're doing that to provide that service that we're providing that is now so instrumental to everything we do, right, in our daily lives. So I think that's one thing we need to do. We need to make general public understand that we are very responsible with our power use, right? You think about it, generally, was it 7 or 8 of the top 10 largest renewable, energy buyers, are hyperscale or other data center companies, right? And we think about, and that really drove that whole, call it renewable energy boom, right? We also think about it, we are incredibly efficient. Our efficiencies, like you said, PUE's at 3, and now they're down to an average of probably 1.2 for any new data center, so dramatic improvements.
They're contracted at that at least.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And so we've made these big improvements, and we've also gotten a lot more, both power dense, which is good from a space efficiency as well. In Loudoun County, which was always a lot of space, was all farmland, now is getting really tight to put a big data center there. And yet we're cramming in a very small footprint now, 100 plus, megawatts. I've recently worked on a project that, we took it from 350 to over 500, megawatts. That was still a pretty tight footprint, right? And we had a lot of restrictions and stuff, and you got homeowners around you. So we're doing a really good job, I think, of increasing that utilization, the power density and the efficiency, and of course, trying to manage that well, all the way from both the infrastructure all the way through the software stack, hardware and software as well. So I think we need to do a better job as an industry really presenting ourselves that way.
Like, in what ways can we do a better job, do you think?
Somehow, as an industry, let the common user of internet services understand our responsibility to ourselves and to everybody else, and how we utilize that power and the efficiency of that, and how we're always focused on it, right? There's so many amazing engineers and other people in this industry that work from everything from the infrastructure and hardware, networking, software stack, that do an incredible job focused on nothing but power efficiency all the time, and so that work has heeded tremendous results. I remember the Cisco switches and routers and Foundry and F5 ones of 2005 compared to today, it's just leaps and bounds more efficient and leaps and bounds better at what they can do. And it's really enabled all these technologies that we use every day. And I think we have to recognize that we should be really proud of what we do as an industry every day, day in and day out. All of us that build, own, and operate data centers and build the infrastructure and hardware that goes into them and the software stacks is like, look what we enable to have happen.
Yeah.
It's remarkable.
Without us, there would not be these things. And I don't look at it through the optics of technology from the consumer side, but I do look at it from the things that affect economy first, and even the impact on communities. Think about if we didn't have data centers for 911 studios, or think about how technology that has helped in better life expectancies or elongate life in terms of we live longer because of technology. Some technologies can include inoculations and medicines, but it really is, technology has done a great deal. Like, I always joke with people and go, have you ever, you're around my age. Do you remember a TV show called All in the Family?
Oh yeah.
With Archie Bunker.
Exactly. I loved it.
Yeah. I'd never make that TV show today. That show would never make it. It's like Blazing Saddles of TV. Yes. But like, I remember watching it going, man, I can't believe this on TV. But I'll tell you, that dude, Archie Bunker, was the same age as me. Right. And the reality is that was at a time, though, that was a different generation of life where the technologies that were the unintended consequences of anything that's new, that's released on civilization, they just let us have it. And then we play with it enough till we figure out, like, hey, maybe we should put some rules around these guns. Oh yeah. Then the automobile industry, maybe we should put some rules around cars. And same with planes. We did powered flight, but cigarettes. And I mean, now there's all kinds of things where they're like, hey, did you know that these things can kill you? Right. But before then, 4 out of 5 doctors would tell you that, Marble lights were better than Camel lights.
Yeah.
There was an asthma cigarette, right? And I only remember that vividly because I had a brother with asthma, and I remember listening to grown-ups talking about asthma cigarettes.
And we think about it now, we go to the doctor's office, the doctor walks in with a tablet.
And look what I was doing.
And he or she has our whole entire chart up there, all of our history. They're taking down notes as we're talking, right? They can take photos, whatever, if they need to. They can, add those notes.
And send it to another part of the world, and they can look at it real time.
Instantly, right? And like, I just had some x-rays taken because I had a bad mountain biking crash a month ago. And so I went and got x-rays taken. And sure enough, hours later, right, I get an email. Here's your x-ray results with your report.
How about that?
Right. And you think about it, in the old days, we would have had some x-rays taken. They would have had the film, right? Would have been, we'd had, they put up on the, you eventually take it and put up on the screen. You go somewhere and it's like this whole long process. You got these big files of all this hard photos effectively, right?
Yeah.
And MRIs weren't even available at that time, And so you just think about like simple things like that we just don't even really think about. And just like getting here today, right? Using maps and Uber and Lyft
Yes.
and the airlines and the ability for them to, text me and say, hey, your bag is on this baggage carousel.
Think about this. It's not just about those things. I agree with you. It comes down to safety, life safety first, healthcare specifically, the diagnosis of things and treating them faster. But what happens when you have a disruption in critical services? You can't dispatch law enforcement or EMS, and you can't get the water turned back on or power turned back on. Can you imagine if we didn't have technology for those things?
Well, I'll give you even a real anecdote to that I just went through. 2 weeks ago, I was evacuated from my home because of a wildfire. Right. And that wildfire, it basically went from 10 miles away to a mile away all in 2 hours. Right.
Okay.
It just was a rapid trend change. And so obviously you get these alerts over text and phone, right?
Yeah.
Automated calls and stuff saying, hey, you need to evacuate, right? But also you get a link saying, here's the evacuation zone, of a map showing the evacuation zone and how it's dynamically changing, right? And evolving, right? And hey, here, this other neighborhood, you need to start planning to evacuate. This one, you need to do it now. And then you also get fire maps where in real time, you can
It'll
sit there
show you where the fires
and show
are at.
exactly where the fire's at from the infrared, satellite imagery and the other, all the planes flying around that are monitoring it and dropping all the air tankers, dropping their fire retardant and water and everything else, right? And you get all these updates of where all the hot spots are, how it's spreading, and you can see it in real time, how many acres it's consumed, and da. Frightening, but the reality is, if I didn't have any of that data, I just would have had a sheriff come to my door saying, you need to get out right now. And that sheriff would have been burdened with trying to go to 16,000 homes, right, in an afternoon to knock on doors, right? Like, it's just impossible. And then, the ability to not actually see what's happening with that fire because you're not near the zone anymore. Now you're evacuated, right? And also my ability to communicate with a friend of mine who had friends in the area and say, hey, I know you, like, who's got room for me, right? And be able to like instantly within minutes have, I got room for you.
But technology allowed you to do that.
That.
And that increases the survivability rate. Like I said, technology is a little bit of a time machine. It gives us more transparency into the situations in real time that allow us to make more meaningful and deliberate and intentional decisions that have a greater impact in the long term. But let me shift gears back. You've had a front row seat since the genesis of this industry, watching the dynamics of power and energy shift. What are some of the other things outside? We're not hogs of power. In fact, I saw something that said, since the genesis of this industry up till now, we're only at 3% total utilization of power relative to the amount of energy that's consumed throughout the United States.
Yeah.
And that number just shifted from 2 to 3, which is a significant, it's a 50% uptick. But again, I credit that 2 to 3 shift as it's plateaued for 10 years. I would say it really hit a hockey stick when we got out of just building IoT or enterprise data centers. We got into cloud data centers, and that had a big impact on the way that we deploy these things because we learned a lot because of the volume and velocity game, right? But then when you look at that, we kind of hit a plateau because we were getting incredibly efficient in design. Then we got efficient at the component levels, people that are making engines to people that are making components to deliver electricities. They were getting more efficient. So the designs were getting efficient, the equipment's more efficient, the building's more efficient, the operators are more efficient. Because this industry was in its infancy. It still is, right? But now you're seeing projections to where we will represent, by the end of 2030, 9% of the total energy utilization that the grid will have to provide for. And a lot of that is, you probably know these numbers better than me. Are we sitting on 2,400 different interconnection grid requests throughout the United States right now? Something ridiculous like that.
In one state alone, there's over 3,500. And so, that's Arizona, right? So if we just look at like this across the country,
let's talk about it.
It is, yeah, absolutely. It is really the issue, right? And so let's dive into that. And I'll dive a little bit into that demand picture. We are getting more efficient industry, but no doubt we are growing, but we're also growing more relative to other demand loads. Most demand in the United States has been flat to actually decreasing, right? And so we as consumers, we're changing out to LED light bulbs and all that stuff, right? We're heat pumps.
Residential homes are the biggest driver for electricity.
Yeah, that's right. It's air conditioning, but ultimately we're getting more efficient. I just installed a bunch of heat pumps in my house. I've got solar and a battery system in my house and stuff like that. So many homes are in California alone. You have,
it's a lot.
Going on almost 2 million homes with solar on it, right? So all that is decreasing the demand on the grid, which is great, right? But now all of a sudden we have our industry, so we're going to
tripling.
That's right. We're growing when a lot of our loads are not, and so obviously we're going to continue to be a much bigger portion of the share. And transmission is the biggest issue. I've written about this in a recent blog post that 251 miles of transmission lines were added in the United States last year. 251.
That seems really low, actually.
It's incredibly low. And so NREL, National Renewable Energy Lab, says, hey, if we're going to get by 2040, if we're going to get to zero carbon, we have to add 91,000 miles of transmission lines. 91,000. We added 251 last year. It's been declining for several years.
Why is this?
I think it's 384 in 2021, right? Why is it declining? Think how difficult it is to run a new transmission line through any urban setting. Pick any city, right? How do you run a new transmission line through someone's backyard? How do you do eminent domain or something to take over houses, right, to run a transmission line? And really, nobody wants a 100-foot power pole in their backyard or ruining their views, right? Nobody does. Yeah. And so we see that in Loudoun County as really a canary in that coal mine, to use a bad energy pun. That's the neighborhoods fighting. They don't want that. And also they're fighting it not just because of the visuals, right? And perhaps the potential, that's right, you got buzzing from that, but also potential like property value, perhaps, decreasing because of the views and stuff like that, perceived value of that home because that transmission line nearby, or, but also they're going, what is it doing for me? What is that transmission pole doing for me? I'm already here. I have my power at my house. I'm just supporting some data center that I don't know what they do. I don't know how it supports me. I don't, so why would I care about, whatever X company in that place, doing whatever they're doing? That doesn't benefit me. So I don't want that power pole in my backyard. So it's getting more and more difficult to permit. It takes a long time to go through that process, 7 to 12 years on average, right? And also all of our utilities are very focused on just serving for their own needs. So we don't have this interconnection between all the different utilities and the regional transmission operators or ISOs, right? And that's something that I'll give a lot of credit actually to the current Biden administration. They really saw this and made a lot of money available through the Infrastructure Investment Act, right? Billions of dollars to help build new transmission lines, right? Right now, 5,600.
Are you giving credit to Biden for transmission lines when we have 251 of them?
5,600 miles have already been permitted of new transmission lines, right? With about half of that already under construction in just the last 2 years from the time that, right, this, the investment, act got put in place, right, to now those are actually happening, right? And some of those are significant. One near me is going to bring about 2,300 gigawatts, right? 2,300 megawatts of capacity, right? New capacity on the grid, because let's face it, renewables are they're the cheapest form of power generation today. Yeah. They've been for a long time, right? Solar wins hands down as far as cost, right? Of anything else.
Hold on, so explain to me, solar wins in hands down in terms of cost on
per kilowatt hour, right? And
for real?
Oh, by a long shot. Solar? It's generally between 1 and 3 pennies per kilowatt hour, right?
That's what it generates, or that's what
the price that solar will sell, any kind of call it utility scale solar will sell into the grid, right?
I thought those were loss leaders. And again, correct me and educate me, because I'm sure I'm not the only one. For some reason, I thought that those things were only great for a certain, how many days a year do they get to calculate what solar will be? I know there's a calculation for it. I forget what it is.
Solar, we're looking at a capacity factor, right? And solar, obviously in Massachusetts, is going to be a 18% capacity factor. In Arizona, it's going to be a 32% capacity factor, right? So 32% of the hours of a year in Arizona is going to be producing kilowatt hours.
Okay, that's a good in Arizona, but that's shit in Pacific Northwest or Boston.
Yeah, not as good. But then you look at okay, obviously we're in Texas right now, and obviously the Panhandle, wind, all the way up through to Dakota. Right? North Dakota has almost a quarter of the U.S.'s total available wind capacity, not installed capacity, but available wind resource.
Because that's
right?
Okay.
It's just the windiest regime. It comes down, the jet stream, the way it comes down, then that's really, Texas wind is really driven by jet stream, right? If we look in California, it's really driven by topography, right? So these, coastal temperatures and the higher inland temperatures, and obviously the two intermixing, creating a high and low pressure, right? So anyways, wind is different everywhere, but if we look at wind, that's generally a capacity factor somewhere in that 25-ish% today, right? But can go as high as about 35-40%. So it depends. Like you go into Kansas, you're at wind at 35% plus.
So that means 35% of their grid capacity in Kansas is coming from wind.
Of the wind power that's installed is actually generating about 35% of the hours, right? So it's an intermittent resource, right? But when it's blowing, when that wind is producing and or that solar, it is producing at an incredibly low rate, right? I've signed, direct PPAs, meaning solar actually on the site. We're not going through utility and transmission tariffs. We're signing those at 2 and 2.5 cents a kilowatt hour. That's all in total, right? For all that energy.
2 to 2.5 cents per kWh.
Incredibly cheap. Yeah,
for wind and
for solar and wind, but wind's harder to come by unless you're like, somewhere in the panhandle or the middle of America, right?
I got you. What parts, how prevalent is that type of, because that's incredibly efficient. That's more efficient than hydroelectric, right?
It is. Yeah. Although hydroelectric is kind of like nuclear. You have to say, okay, hydroelectric and nuclear both are somewhat subsidized by the federal government, heavily subsidized, have been.
Isn't solar?
Not anywhere to the same level, right? We subsidize solar at a tune of somewhere around $1 billion a year. We've subsidized oil and gas at the tune of about 25 to 40 billion a year, depending on the year.
Did we really?
Right. And then if you look at like all those big hydroelectric plants that were built in the Columbia and Snake River, right back in the 50s, those were all effectively paid for by our taxpayer money at that time, right? And so they're effectively free, right? They were paid for and bought, for by federal funds. And now, of course, hence why there isn't really much of an operating expense. It's pretty cheap
just
to
water.
Maintain that.
Yeah.
Just open the gates and manage that water flowing through, and occasionally do some repowering, right? Where you change out the generator, something new, or do a little maintenance. But you think about those dams now are approaching 70 years old, right?
Yeah, we have some aging infrastructure.
We do. And some of those, like Chelan County PUD, I think it was Chelan County PUD had one of their key dams, they had a big crack in it, 10 years ago or so. They had to do a repair on it, but it's pretty frightening, right? You have one of those dams go, you take out Portland. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's a major impact. The amount of water that's flowing through the Columbia River is just tremendous. And obviously, we're not going to develop new big hydro anymore. That's just not going to happen for environmental reasons and also all the good, really, locations that have been taken, right? And so I really don't see hydroelectric has been slowly declining, but very gradually slowly declining. The repowering kind of maintains it, but obviously we've just decommissioned 3 dams on the Klamath River, right? That was a lawsuit that's been being fought for 25, 30 years, right? Maybe even 40 years. Yeah. And those, because ultimately, is combination of the, one, those dams were way they were aged, right? They were 80 plus years old, right? They were no longer functional. They were hurting the environment, right? Anyways, a long story, but I think we're going to see that with all hydroelectric, right? It's going to be tough to build that. Solar is easy. If I want to go build a power plant today and I'm a power developer, which I've been, I can get a solar power plant permitted in as little as a month. Right. I could go build it. And I'm talking about utility scale. I'm not talking about little small scale, because there's really no impacts, right? Generally speaking, you're putting it in a place where it's really most times there's very little impact. There's no noise. You have really no visual to other people for the most part, depending on where it's at. Right. And it is incredibly cheap to both install, but also to operate. And it just produces power whenever that sun shines, and we know it's going to shine. And so it's really
and the average is like 30% of the time, 1/3 of your time. You're saying if you have a solar, your capacity in Arizona is 38 or 34, whatever you said. So that means 34% of the time your grid is running on solar.
Yeah, that's right. And we're seeing more and more of that as renewables grow right over time. So I'll give you a couple statistics. In the last 10 years, solar has grown by more than 10x as far as capacity on the grid. These are stats out of the U.S. Energy Information Administration, right? Coal is reduced by about 50% of total, coal power generation in the U.S. We see natural gas go up. Coal got cut in half. Natural gas went up by about 50%, right, in total power generation. And really, we need natural gas because it can quickly turn on and off to really fill in for when that wind and solar isn't producing, right? Wind and solar will continue to grow, is my belief, because they're the price leader. They're the cheapest option out there. They're easy to develop.
There's no storage for it, though.
Well, I mean, today we're gaining storage, right? I've installed both a 3 and a 1 gigawatt battery system, right? That was obviously those are grid connected systems. And those are big, and we're seeing those today, right? Those big grid connected systems. And even, one of the biggest power generating owners in the U.S., right, has been investing heavily. They're planning on 100 gigawatts of battery over the next couple years, because they recognize that they need that to fill in for two things. One, the changes in demand, but also the changes in weather that affect solar, wind, and all the other, and demand, right? Obviously, natural gas can fill in for that. Coal is going to eventually fade away, as it really needs to from an emissions and health and safety point of view, right? And hydroelectrics, as we talked about, is going to kind of fade away. Nuclear's been really flat, right, for the most part. Just slightly, it's gone up 3% over the last 10 years, and that's just because of really some efficiency gains. And really one new
what do you think about
plant. Well, I don't think it's really so much regulational. It's undoubtedly part of it. But who wants a nuclear power plant in their backyard, right? That's the real
Every
challenge.
Navy base has them parked all over. Every Navy base has a nuclear reactor parked right there.
Sure. Yeah, and that is true, right? But that's not that many relative to the engines and turbines that we all, I just flew on a 35 megawatt power plant.
Who wants to see solar panels though everywhere? Who wants to see those big, wind farms everywhere?
Believe it or not, property values, actually, the studies show they go up around wind farms, and also the same for solar. And I don't remember those numbers are, but it can be substantial. I remember somewhere on that 20%. They're probably not going to go up if you're located right next to a nuclear power plant. Now, I say probably. Obviously, I've not seen any studies on that. But nuclear, I do believe it. Like, I completely agree with you that nuclear has to be part of the solution. It already is part of the solution. About 20% of the U.S.'s power generation capacity. It's substantial, right? And we've only built one nuclear power plant since 1980 in the U.S., right? One new one, 2 phases on it, but one new one. That's it. It's hard.
But we just turned on 3 Mile Island for Microsoft.
They're going to, but also look at that expense. It's at the expense of that. It's over basically $2,000 per megawatt to turn that back on. Put that in perspective. We can install brand new, state-of-the-art natural gas turbines or engines today, highly efficient, right, at less than half that cost, or let's just call it less than that cost, right? Obviously, going to vary a lot by location and other specifics.
With what? What's half that cost? What would you put on that? I mean, $200,000 a megawatt. That's what you're saying. The install
$2,000 a megawatt to throw that on for the capex cost. Yeah.
What are some of the options that are cheaper? Because once you turn it on, I mean.
Sorry, get my numbers wrong. It's $2,000 a kilowatt. Yeah, so
sure.
I got a unit off there.
I was following you. But my thing is, I'm like, what is more tenable or scalable in the long term? Like, do you see solar getting to a higher level of capacity in terms of efficiency of technology? Meaning I can leave, like we could seem to, the density of solar can maintain maybe the same size it is and I get more out of it, or do I have to just lay down more solar?
That's happening. I mean, the panels themselves are getting about 1% more efficient about every other year, right? But the cost of them is going down by about 25% per year. Dramatic cost improvements, but that's starting to flattening out, right? We've had that kind of cost improvements for years. The challenge of solar, of course, is that duck curve we hear about in so many places, right? California predominantly, where basically once the sun goes down, you lose all that generation. And of course, it's right at that time, 5, 6, 7 p.m. at night.
Everybody's going home.
Everybody's going home and turning the air conditioners on.
Running their wash.
Yeah, putting something in the oven. Yeah, exactly, right? And so it's really hard on the grid. Those grid managers are really struggling because you used to have really base kind of demand stayed flat and really generation stayed flat. Now you have this highly variable generation, but also highly variable demand, right? Because people are we're working at home, they're turning stuff off. We can turn it off remotely, I can control my house remotely and all this stuff, right? So none of that has to run right now, right? And so, all that, it just has to run when I'm there and I need it. And of course, now all of a sudden everything's also, it's IOT, so it's all, be able to adjust and manage, right? Instead of just setting a fixed temperature, you can have it adjust automatically based on what you're working from home or whatever, right? You don't need as cold or whatever in the house. So anyways, those things are changing, but now pretty much all solar developers are installing battery. That's pretty much like, we're just seeing across the board, about 50% of all new interconnection requests for solar include battery, right? And some of them, of course, are like a molten salt where they can run for another 3 to 5 hours, right, after the sun goes down. In Nevada, there's one of those going in right now. It's a gigawatt-sized system, right? And it'll run for as much as 6 hours after the sun goes down.
How's that?
It heats up molten salt to 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit.
Is that what it does?
Yeah, you heat it up really, really hot, and then of course you can produce steam for hours after that. Same thing as any thermal power plant.
Sure.
That would do it. So it's a really efficient mechanism because you're basically using this free energy during the day to allow you to really ride through that most expensive cost of power, the highest demand that generally hits somewhere between noon and 6 p.m. right, and you can really provide really expensive power now that's really cheap to build, right? So you can make a lot of money on it. And with the batteries, they're expensive, right? And they're big. They're not the
What kind of batteries are we talking about here, though?
big lithium, but they're lithium iron phosphate. Not the kind of lithium ion we think of like in a Tesla or something, electric car, right? That's more typical in an electric car today. Lithium iron phosphate just come down so low in price. It's incredibly stable and safe. We use it in our data centers, right, as replacements to the lead acid batteries, right? And it's still expensive, but when you look at the fact that solar generator can generate electricity at 1-2 cents a kilowatt hour, sell it to the grid. It's whatever the marginal price of electricity is. So we're selling at the grid at, maybe it's 2 cents and, maybe they're never really selling at 2 cents. It's always going to be probably at noon or something, maybe in the morning it's 2 cents. And then by noon it goes up to, 80 cents, 8 cents, 8 cents, right? $80 a megawatt hour or something, right? And then by the afternoon, maybe it's like, hitting 10 cents a kilowatt hour, right? And then it drops back down to, low at night, but now they can keep providing that power with that battery system for another few more hours, right? Maybe it's only 1, 2, or 3, but it's typically around that 3-hour range. That's a great thing for the grid. It's a great thing for the renewable energy developer, but it's a really great thing for the grid because it helps stabilize it, right? And that's really what kind of saved California and Texas really over these hot summer waves we've had this year.
With solar?
Battery.
Oh, okay.
So battery systems, right? Because now these battery systems, when you think about it, you have multiple gigawatt-sized battery systems that are connected to the grid. They are tremendous for helping.
How big is like a gigawatt battery system? Is it like, think of it like, is it a football field
Depends
size?
how much you stack them, right? Because they're always stackable, right? But no, I'll give you an example. The 3.5 gigawatt system, that fit on an old coal plant that got converted to natural gas that was then so old, they eventually just shut it down, right? And it all got fit really on within that old natural gas power plant. All the infrastructure was torn out. We used the same building and then threw a bunch down on the land outside, right? Obviously, you already have the grid connection. That's your most valuable asset today, right? As we talked about earlier, like that is the limiting factor today. It's not generation. The challenge is getting generation onto the grid, and the challenge for us as data center operators and other demand, users is really getting those interconnections for the demand.
Why do the interconnections take so long?
Well, again, it's a long permitting process to build a new transmission line. If you already have a transmission connection, obviously that's easy, right? Unless we have to really upsize it. But if you don't have a transmission connection there, you go into a site where there just isn't that. Let's say in this little business park here where it's just a bunch of little buildings. It's probably got a megawatt and a half of load in this little business park. And all of a sudden a data center operator buys it and says, we're going to put a 4-story data center here. It's going to be 250 megawatts.
Yes.
Right. You're going to need a transmission connection, right? And it's going to need to be at least 120 kV to handle that kind of capacity and probably even higher than that. So now it's in you have big poles, right? And you got to get that somehow into this urban setting that's already built out. Right. So you have to really you have to put along existing right of ways like freeways or railways, right? You're not going to put it right through someone's neighborhood and over their neighborhood.
I wish there was a way to put it underground somehow.
We can. You add about 3 times the cost to put those transmission lines underground. So it's a big added cost. And you also effectively derate it. You can't put as high capacity. Reconductoring is one of the big things, right? You think about it. These transmission lines, they're purely just strands of aluminum cable wrapped around a steel cable sheath, right? And nowadays we can build conductors that really can handle 2 to 3x the capacity by basically instead of just having aluminum strands, we can make them really aluminum trapezoids that all just blend into together. So you get rid of all that open free space between them, right? And you also go to like a carbon fiber core, right, instead of a steel core, so you can handle a lot more weight and be a lot lighter for the poles to handle that extra conductoring, right? And you can also put sensors on them. If you think about this, almost all transmission lines don't even know what the temperature of them are, right? We know, I have, probably 20 temperature sensors in my house alone, right? I can monitor remotely. But, utilities don't even really know what those temperatures are of those transmission lines. But, that's a pretty cheap add-on that they can do. And now by monitoring that, they know where the limits are they can push to. It's because they're very conservative, right? They don't want to start wildfires. They don't want that line to, come too close to the ground and cause, some other issue, right? So, they're very conservative how they operate those. So if we put some sensoring on those and reconductor, we can get a lot more capacity on those. But that still means you have to be on the same line, on that line that's already there, right? And if we look at about transformers alone are a 4+ year timeline, right? Lead time to get transformers, right? And we always have to step up from generation and step back down to where the load is, right? And so we not only have those losses, but we have those expenses, but we have to buy that equipment, those components. And right now we're a 4+ year lead time to get that component. So we have that alone. But the right of ways, if we have to build new lines, is really where it's at. And you think about just Arizona, back to my example, 3,500 renewable power plants running on the grid in Arizona, right? Tribes and neighborhoods and other people, fight them because they're like, hey, we don't want this transmission line in our backyard. Even though, like you say, spend years trying to route it and get the right, pathways. It is really difficult to get everybody to say, yeah, we're okay with this.
So let's keep talking about this more, because we're talking about the efficiencies of power and where our options are to get it. Transmission seems to be the biggest challenge that we have. You could generate it wherever you want to. You still got to transmit that power. So to have large aggregate volumes of space to put up wind farms, and they're geographically, it's not like you just put them anywhere. And in some cases you can for certain volumes of velocity of power, but in most cases you need to find the right geography in the United States or the right placement within your building where you're going to put it if you're doing it at a micro level, right? If we can't solve for transmission, which it sounds like there isn't a solution for transmission anytime soon, we're going to start seeing operators that are going to go, they're going to go prime, right? And what do you see? Maybe they just go out and they build in markets specifically for AI data centers. AI data centers offer us a unique opportunity to pivot, right? Because they're not so latency sensitive. So that means they're just chewing large language models all day long. They just need more volumes of energy to be able to do that. So we go to places that are underserved in this market, tier 3, right? And as long as we get a labor force for that, we could self-generate, right? And self-generation is something that you know shit about. And I think a lot of the industry is leaning more that direction. Do you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. And here's my belief is that if we're sitting around waiting for transmission lines to come, we're going to be waiting 10+ years.
We're not waiting.
And who's going to wait? You can't just sit around and wait. And I think if you're banking on those utilities to be there, we've seen over and over again in my past recent experience, with Vantage and other, companies, we see over and over again the utilities are not able to perform right to the schedule that they're hoping to. And you can't blame them.
And they don't care though either. Like there's no punishment for them missing.
No, anything. There isn't. They're an incumbent, regulated monopoly, right? So you don't have a choice. You have to get that transmission capacity from them. And they're up against a lot of constraints and challenges, right, to providing that, And so I don't believe that transmission is going to be easily solvable. I think we can do things to solve it. And like I said, I give credit to the Biden administration for at least we've got 5,000 miles of new transmission lines with significant amount of capacity, right? That's being built, right? That's a big win, right?
But we only did 250 last year.
The problem is it's still going to take years for that. Well, that 252 was already planned out 10 years ago, right? What's being planned and built right now won't even be operational for the first time until 3 years from now, right? So it's a long way out before that's even going to start adding benefits, right? And each of those lines, of course, has a different timeline. So we have a long time to wait for that capacity. And you have to be on those lines anyways to get the capacity or for the generation to get added onto those lines, right? But at least they connect some big cities. So that's good. So in my belief, the only way you can really solve this today, right now, if you really want to scale, and scale, I would say, is really anything over megawatts, not even hundreds of megawatts, because the utilities just don't have it, is you have to self-generate.
Yeah.
And absolutely, the only really ability to do that today at scale in a power-dense way is natural gas, right? And I think a lot of people have this real negative reaction to natural gas.
Why is that?
I don't understand it, but I think there's this belief that natural gas is really dirty or bad.
Or less reliable.
Well, and if we look at it, a natural gas transmission line is a 6 nines uptime utility, whereas a electric utility transmission line is 3 nines, right? So already we're basically we're hours ahead, almost an 8 hour, almost a 9 hour improvement, right, in uptime just in those two per year of outage, right? And those two kind of utility services, a standard utility service, right? So already we're dramatically better. So there is that improvement, but also from a reliability point, we can get more in reliability in a moment, but let's kind of touch on why do people think gas is, I don't know, right? But if we look at modern day, gas has been the driver of really any modern day power plant construction for decades, right? Because one, it's low cost. It can be relatively or very efficient, right? Even better than coal plants by a long shot. And it generally is low emissions, it's permittable, right? Because it is low emissions. We get rid of all those terrible particulates and heavy metals and stuff that coal has, right? So we dramatically clean up the coal generation, which in the United States, right, is still a significant portion of generation, roughly a third.
Huge.
Right?
It's more than that.
It's as much as 50%.
Yeah.
nationwide and different numbers.
Like Colorado is 85%.
You look at Utah, Montana, Wyoming. Obviously, those states have they're 95%.
Yeah.
Right. So or have been, right. But that's getting
they don't
replaced.
Have solar. They don't have wind.
wind.
They don't have hydro. They have no option.
Yeah. So that's getting replaced, and that's good. But natural gas can replace it quicker. So I see natural gas as really a vehicle to help us make our air cleaner today, make our grid cleaner by getting rid of the coal plants sooner. Also, it enables the wind and solar to happen, right? They don't happen without it because that wind and solar is variable. All of a sudden, this cloud cover comes in, you lose that solar, right? And it's hard to predict wind.
That's why I asked. You're talking about capacity. I'm like, some of the days that I've been told, and everybody you talk to, people have. I look at this industry almost philosophically as religion, where you have some people that are like, I could talk to people on engines, and there could be some that are reciprocating only, and they'll give you chapter and verse on all the reasons why turbines don't work, or vice versa, right? And there's no wrong answers. There's no silver bullet for this industry. And just like there wasn't in the mechanical permutation, the way we cool data centers in Chicago ain't the same as what we do in Arizona.
That's right.
Right. So like we have to look at the way that we're looking at electrical distribution or generation is a completely like case by case. Deregulation within an energy market also makes a big difference. I mean, Texas will have a big upside to certain things because of capacity that they have towards natural gas.
That's right. And I'm agnostic to the type of
Me too.
generation.
I don't care.
I don't care either.
I want to know them all though. I want to unpackage them all.
And I really see oftentimes the best solution is actually a mix, and it's a hybrid, because each obviously type of generation has its pros and cons, right? And so we want to balance that, and we have challenges in the data center industry. We're not a flat load. We are variable. And every data center, I have a saying I've been saying since the year 2000 that every data center starts at zero load and eventually never gets to 100% of its design load, right? And so we start at zero load. How do you really have a generation source that has to be base loaded, right? Support a zero load at the start, right? And it takes time to ramp that up, years or at least months, right? So you have to be able to feed into that. And if transmission is a constraint, that means we're not connected to the grid, we're islanded. And I've been very fortunate to have been able to develop many multi-hundred megawatt islanded data centers, self-powered data centers over the last couple of years, right? And even one of those was developed and will become the largest fuel cell installation in the world, right? Of anything. So completely, islanded, right? And these are all islanded because there was no other choice. You can sit there and wait the 10 years, or you can develop now, right? And serve the market today. And I believe that's a better option, particularly if you can do it pretty cleanly. And the fuel cells, it wasn't because they're cheaper or
they're more expensive than anything.
Smaller footprint. That's right. We got them down to about 5x the footprint and cost of more conventional forms of generation, engines and turbines, right? Which was reasonable. And in that utility scheme, it was actually next year, it will actually be at parity with the utility, right? And what
hydrogen will be? Like
not
fuel
hydrogen.
Cell?
These are solid oxide fuel cells, so they are fueled by natural gas.
Okay.
Right, but that's including the carbon credits and all that incorporating in there. So that means by the time it's built, it will actually be cheaper than the utility is because of those cost increases that are expected on the utility, and also where gas is so darn stable as a fuel source, right? And you can of course buy strips, multiple years out. And the other benefit of natural gas is twofold. One is that if you blend in RNG, renewable natural gas, it's actually carbon negative. Carbon negative. We can't do carbon negative with hydrogen. You can't even get there with hydrogen, right? But we can get there today with RNG, right? Over the same pipelines, exact same equipment. A lot of it's available, right? Because we're offsetting that 80x times the global
potential. What are the different types
methane.
of natural gases? There's a few different types, RNG, but there's isn't there like a dirty natural gas, like a gray or a brown natural gas?
Yeah, there's some different flavors.
There's some different numbers that
there
people
are.
Yeah, I don't know what the efficiencies of those are.
Well, yeah, exactly. Each one's going to have a little bit different of a carbon.
It has to.
That's right. Yeah, and no doubt about it. Natural gas is not carbon free. It isn't, right? But when we put those emissions controls on those turbines or recips or use fuel cells, we really cut down dramatically on those particulates, but also on the other emissions. And we can cut down also on carbon, right? We can cut down on, I shouldn't say carbon, we cut down on CO, we can cut down on NOx, we cut down a lot of these really key local air constituents, right, that our local economies care about. I developed a project very close by, I'll just say somewhere in Texas, all right? And this is very recent, right? And, originally we had planned the data center to be about 150 megawatts, right? But with the emissions controls that we put on it, we could actually take it to 250 megawatts in the same footprint that we had already planned, right? And with that emissions control, still meet those local emissions requirements, right? And if we took out the diesel gensets, we actually could have got it to about 350 megawatts, right? Unfortunately, the customer still was like, no, we got to hold on to those diesel gensets. But the big benefit of natural gas as well is that any engine or turbine today will burn any blend really of hydrogen or ammonia or whatever other like fuel, clean fuel we can put at it. Now, my belief is I've worked on an electrolysis, a big electrolysis plant for to create hydrogen recently. This is a couple of years ago, 2-3 years ago. And it's difficult. It's expensive. It takes a lot of energy, takes a lot of water, right? You can't put it in too many places. And the challenge of hydrogen is you can't really be in the smallest molecule, push it over all of our existing pipelines and not have it leak through the seals and everything else, right? That are designed for much bigger molecules. And so hydrogen is challenging to move. And then you got to truck it really, then you lose pretty much your carbon benefit. And it's very expensive, right? And if you store it, you're effectively storing, it's going to be the same as storing propane.
Yes.
So you have to have big offsets and all that stuff. So now you're taking up a lot of footprint to store it. And who wants to have, whatever it is, 10 hydrogen trucks making deliveries a day, right? To keep your on-site, full-time powered data center running, right? That's not really a palpable option. So hence why I think natural gas is really the option today. And if we can blend in hydrogen, RNG, things like that into the existing natural gas lines, right? As much as we can do that, all that generation will burn as much as possible. And then we keep lowering that carbon footprint. So it enables renewables, it enables us to get rid of the coal, and enables us to get that power today, while then we can transition to things like you say, where we can do SMRs or other forms of nuclear, big, grid scale or small scale, right? Or other forms of generation, whether it's wind or solar or battery gets even so much better as an option, right? We're going to need all these things.
At some point, how many of those components need to be put together in a collection to create a microgrid? Or are we in essence already kind of doing that with all these? If you're using batteries already and you're using natural gas generators and you're using solar and you're using wind, and then you have diesels back up to a utility, if you're running these things as, prime generation sort of stuff, you're creating your own microgrid at some capacity already, aren't you?
Yeah, absolutely. And my belief, if it's well optimized and really planned out ahead, we don't need the diesel standby gens because, believe it or not, they're more expensive than the industrial turbines and reciprocating engines are that can run 8,760 hours a year for that engine that's only designed to only run 50 hours a year. So why would you spend more money on something that really adds you no value? Right? It's a cobweb.
That is, again, one of those things which I'm not saying I agree or disagree, but that's a philosophical, religious element of our industry I've seen so far, to where people are, whether it's some designs that have a catcher bus with a simple engine that they all share, whoever gets their first wins, or a distributed redundant model where they have one literally for every bus. I have seen the AI workloads get to the point where you're not going to put diesel engines on for those things.
Well, if we think about it,
you're going to go turbines.
Yeah, I would think so. And think about it, turbines can switch to really 5 or 6 different fuels instantly without any loss.
There's a lot
of
of inefficiencies to those turbines though as well.
That's right. They're not the most efficient,
if they're not fully loaded, they don't run really well. They eat a shitload of gas, right? And if their temperatures are so high, you have to deregulate those things at a certain point.
Everything deregulates with heat. It's just a matter of, at to what temperature, right?
That's fair. Totally fair.
Yeah. I mean, 3 Mile Island is an example of that, right?
Yeah. But that reactor, if people understood what happened, there was a secondary coolant.
That's right.
Problem. The design, that's like saying the data center didn't work right. That's why it's on engine right now. You're like, it was designed for that. That's an operational mode.
Yeah, and we can say the same thing about really Fukushima too, right? It was the auxiliary systems that really failed. Right. Yeah. And that's a design flaw. And any power generation system can fail with heat, whether it's a solar panel or, the
Navy over the last 75 to 76 years has created 34 different types of nuclear power plants and propulsion systems. They've iterated off each one of those ones, but they've not had a significant problem ever in any of them, because it's one of those things that I think that we all know. Once we saw the weapons get used, then the respect that we had for the way that we converted it to energy changed, right? And I think that the only thing that's stopping us from using those products more is fear.
Yeah, without a doubt. There is we do need to get over that as a society, right? We need to get more comfortable with nuclear because it is one of our best clean energy solutions, right? Yeah. So we're going to have to get over that as a society and be a little more comfortable with it. But we're also going to have to, us as industry stewards, right? Whether data center power stewards, whatever, the utilities, those that develop these nuclear power plants of the future, right? We're going to be really good about not just working with the public, but really how we design and manage those to ensure that the public feels safe, right? And that is that's going to take
It's
a lot of effort and time.
It's optics. I think I talked to you once, like months ago. Did you ever watch that Nuclear Now? That show?
I have not. I need to watch it.
Choke yourself. You got to go watch it, especially with your love for power. You got to watch how there's a dichotomy between, he bifurcates it very well between nuclear weapons and nuclear energy. And you have the words of, the Sierra Club and Greenpeace and all them going up there being like, hey, look, we were right about everything except for that part. Like, no nukes was just one of those things where no one wants nuclear weapons. No one does. None of us do. But nuclear energy seems to be something that is much, I think it's the only option we have to transform humanity and really have a significant impact on climate change ever.
Well, renewables are doing it today. Renewables are part of that. The challenges are intermittent.
We're outdoing what renewables is taking away. We're still creating more. The volume of demand that we're using to create more IT space is an example. Like, we're putting up data centers in gigawatt campuses now. There's no chance that's an untenable.
We can't self-power that with wind or solar.
You're right.
Unless we have a massive footprint, right? And there's great places to put that wind or solar, right? But then it requires a transmission to get it to the demand. Yeah. And as a matter of fact, I got off the plane today and a guy, I was filling up my water bottle, and a guy goes, Casey, and I'm like, hey, and it was a friend of mine he works at Google, and I'm like, oh, what you doing? And he's like, oh, I'm going to, this place. And I'm like, oh yeah, for the power, right? And because I'm like, oh yeah, I know they're developing there, right? But it's like that place has power, and it's one of those places where there's an abundance of that, and also the transmission capacity today. But those are rapidly disappearing.
Yeah.
Right. And and so yes, we're going to have to develop more both baseload, right? But baseload is challenging because like I said, our demand is becoming much more variable and volatile. You think about EVs, and I'm not just talking about electric vehicles, but electric planes and helicopters and whatever else, right? All the electrification of heat pumps and stuff. A lot of this turns on and off a lot more now, right? And it turns on at different times of the day. We as a society need to also get better about pricing electricity. Because you think about it, we really are talking about the only commodity in the world that has to be consumed instantaneously as it's created, right? And yet we don't provide a price signal to the consumer. You and I price stuff all the time, whether, whatever something, it's a grocery, it's price of fuel, it's a price of travel, any service. That's right. We're always pricing that out. And obviously a lot of those things vary quite a bit. And yet we tell our consumer, don't worry about the cost of electricity. Don't worry about what you're going to use. And then we just send them a bill a month later and you go, here's what the price is, right? And on Superstorm Uri, here in Texas, obviously that was really problematic when the price went to $9,000 a megawatt hour, right? And it was just like, oh my God.
Crazy.
Right. And the FERC, Texas is the only really grid / regional operating authority in the US that doesn't want to transport much power over state lines, so they don't have to be in our FERC mandate. But FERC had a rule, I think it was $1,000 or $2,000 a megawatt hour, right? So it was a much lower cap, right? And that's been in place for a long time. So that's helpful. But that's a market thing. But the reality is, like, a lot of people hit a lot of pain point, but the reality is they didn't really know it at the time. Well, now we have companies like Griddy and stuff that are really providing, power to the homeowner that will tell them, send them alert. Hey, your price of power is getting really high right now. Do you want to,
interesting,
curtail some energy use?
I think technology will give us that level of transparency and visibility. Right?
Absolutely, it can
to the consumer.
That's right. And
by now, the consumer is the business on the wholesale side.
Yeah, and we as data centers, like I've done about 1,500 megawatts of data centers for demand response. Well, lately, maybe adding another 300 or 400 onto it in the last year or two. And we can do that. We could do it different forms of generation. But if we can have on-site generation that's dispatchable, and we can now connect to that transmission system when it connects. That's the thing. You think about you asked about this bridging. Like, we put in natural gas as a bridging solution, as a 5 or 10 year solution. Once we pay for it, it's good for pretty much eternity.
Until it stops running, yeah.
That's right. That system's going to last for 25 plus years, right? And so we might as well just keep operating it. Now, it can scale down if the grid has available power and we want to utilize that available power from the grid, or we can actually provide power to the grid, right, when the grid really needs it. And now we can be selling power at a really high rate because that power is varying tremendously, right? Sometimes by orders of magnitude, not even one order of magnitude, but many orders of magnitude by the price point per day. So now we can arbitrage the fuel that we have and the capacity we have of power to sell that capacity, right, to the grid when it really needs that energy, which is immensely valuable. Right now, we could become a net resource to the grid instead of just it a net demand.
So let's scratch the pain on that, because I agree. I do see these engines. Like, I've talked to the CEOs of multiple operators, right, and or someone, the COO, the CEO, the strategic people that have to solve for this in the long term. And every one of them that I've spoken with has talked about this shift, where we're really colliding two industries. Like, I love talking about the technology aspect. You talk about it from an application perspective, almost as a subject matter expert. And I have to look at it and try to learn from that through you. And then I simultaneously have to flip the optics, because I view it all through I'm a technology incubator for labor and services. That's it. Right. So I'm trying to figure out, how do yeah, you're right. Engineering wise, technology wise, something may be on paper perfectly, just like the M&A of Exodus versus whoever else, and the pill was too big for them to swallow, as you said. It may look right application wise, but we still have to collide one new industry to the other. And the supply chain of this side, the oil and gas side, that supply chain, that ecosystem is, I think, what gives the operators on the data center side the greatest level of fear, is understanding when they could have access to the engines they want, because now we're talking about a different product, right? And they're no longer just buying diesel and they're on a bake off. There's 5 or 6 groups that offer them. Those people aren't really necessarily selling so hard. They're just taking orders and figuring out who's going to get what based on who. I mean, there is so much demand for an engine provider right now that they're not struggling. Do you agree?
Let's put some clarity on that.
Yes.
As a data center industry, no doubt, like, we have years lead time to get diesel gen sets, right? And you're right. Those people making them,
and their product, the space, power, and cooling, the primary line of business they use to generate revenue is the space, the power, and the cooling of the data center, the infrastructure, the MEP itself. And they have spent years designing a VMI, a vendor management inventory strategy. It's the strategy as a contractor, as OFCI, owner furnished contractor installed. So that they have people like you on their team that are armed to the teeth and sophisticated on how they make purchasing decisions. And now you introduce these natural gas engines and now, turbines and things like that. And they're like, wait a second, because these guys are going to sell it to the first group that wants 500. It could be the manufacturing plant down the line. It could be whoever, right? And these people are like, you don't understand how we scale. We want to have transparent, repeatable, predictable resources from our partners, and we need to make sure we're going to get this steady volume all the time. And engine providers don't operate like that.
Well, let me tell you why I think on-site power is actually a solution to that. Because today we're like you said, roughly 2 to 3% of the U.S.'s energy demand, right? Power demand, right? So it's called 3%. And so that's 3% of the power demand is waiting in line to get standby diesel gensets. Realize 100% of the power demand, all of it that serves the power to our data centers, and the other 7% of the other demand load is all being powered by, guess what?
Turbines.
Big industrial turbines, engines, and also wind turbines and solar panels. So all of a sudden we open up our market from a 3% of the market of standby gens to 100% of the power generation market. And we look at on-site power, because we're not using diesel standby gens to do on-site power. You can't do that full time.
You're using those because you don't trust all the other services that you just mentioned.
Yeah. So think about, we're now stepping into the utility realm and also the industrial realm, because these are industrial engines and turbines. They're made to run 8760 all out, unlike those diesel standby gens, right? They're made to be easily maintainable, right? I mean, a typical turbine, you don't even do a bore scope on except once a year, full-time operation, right? You don't even do like a maintenance cycle to 35,000 hours. 5 years in, you do a bigger maintenance cycle. So you're running a thing nonstop for 5 years before even let's just shut the thing down.
That's based on how heavy it's loaded. That's based on how
very
heavy.
much.
Okay.
It depends on
not
a lot of
loaded
factors.
heavy, then you got problems.
That's right. But the key point is that these are industrial equipment made to run all day, all in and out, in all kinds of really harsh environments, right? And they're reliable, right? And they can do a lot of things. And the grid's already using them to provide the power to our data centers. So why don't we just simply cut out that step up transformer, that step down transformer, the losses on that transmission line?
I'm with you.
That's non-existent.
The enterprise people are already going that way.
That's right.
And the operators can't, because they have SLA on their contracts.
Well, I believe we can, because
reliability's not there though yet.
It is. For one, the equipment's far more reliable than the standby diesel gens. Two is the gas is far more reliable. It's not a single fuel, because we can easily put in multi-fuel engines and turbines.
No, a single point of failure if you have one turbine that's 18 megs.
Well, you'd never put in one turbine to run just your load.
Right.
You'd always have redundancy, right? And that's where this optimization comes in and talk about. Guys like me I've spent a lot of time really figuring out how to optimize for that data center from that zero load, as I said, to that 100% load that it may eventually reach, right? And how to deal with that in the hot days and the cold days, right? How to deal with it in variable load. We have an AI workload that slams on on and off at 10 megawatts every second or so, right? To a very stable cloud-based environment that's much more just gradually ramping, right? Undoubtedly, like I've figured that out, right, on how to do that and do it so it's efficient, right, in both footprint. It's actually in smaller footprint than the utility substation is. And so we're actually going, whoa, we don't even need to buy the utility substation. We don't have to plop it down. We can actually, in a smaller footprint, right, this is that 350 megawatt site I talked about. We took it to 500 megawatts because we could actually fit with our on-site power more power and higher density than the utility substation could provide us, right? And so now we could actually, and we could scale whatever speed you want to go, because I call up the CEO of, turbine company X, Y, and Z and engine company X, Y, Z, and I say, hey, can you give me 1,000 megawatts next year? I literally asked this question of several CEOs of these companies because now, I've got relationships with these guys, right? I've been working with them for a while. I want a dedicated
gig, 250 megawatts.
And I tell them I want 1,000 megawatts next year, and they all telling me, at the beginning of this year, Q1, Q2, no problem. Right. Q3, they're like, yeah, no, we're not going to be able to give you 1,000 megs next year, but I can by 2026, and I give you this much for next year.
That's what you leave.
I can't call up, any of those standby diesel companies to say, give me even 500 megawatts by 2026. They would all just say, yeah, get in line, right? And 4 years later, I'll get you something.
Yeah, I think that there's no choice. Everyone's kind of moving to the other side of the party now when it comes to engines. But it's really, again, looking at it from a technology application perspective is one thing, but we're really turning data centers into power generation plants, not just for data. It's not, they're going to come as a part in which if they have 100 megawatts, they're going to have to self-produce, but they'll probably have to add on top of that more to give back to the grid, up to 50%.
That's right. I even had to work on a contract recently where that was the only way the utility would bring capacity.
Give me 150, I'll give you 100 back.
That's right. You have to be able to curtail and provide capacity back to us.
Yes.
Which I have I'm a little mixed on that, because like here we are now, we're providing the utilities peak power prices and peak emissions, right? Those peaking power plants, we're offsetting those for them. And so I don't think that's fair to us as a consumer to have to be required to do that. Now, we should be able to participate in those markets openly and freely, right? If we want to do that and we want to arbitrage and win from that or whatever, how we want to play it, then great, right? But I don't think utilities should force it. But the reality is we're going to be forced to bring our own power, right? However that is.
Or stop adopting emerging technology, one of the two, right? That ain't going to happen.
That's right.
So we have to solve for power.
We have to solve for it. And what better thing to do is actually put the demand, the big demand, with the generation, right? Why
I'm with you. I actually agree with a lot of this stuff. I think that it's like a vending machine. We're going to have to rock this 5 or 6 times over the next few years before it tips, because that's what it takes. It takes a tipping point before you know how long it took, Casey, before 1 in 4 Americans adopted electricity from the time electricity was introduced to the market? 46 years.
Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, it just takes us time to adopt emerging technology.
It does, but I'm really like, partly why I love talking with you about this and sharing this on your podcast, but also at conferences and things, because I am so passionate about this, because when I look at, I'm an energy geek. I read
truly
energy stuff all day long, right? I mean, not all day long, but every day I'm reading this stuff, right? And from all different angles. And I love to understand what's going on from the big picture, right? And if we look at the big picture, we are, in my belief, set for grid failures over and over again. The reliability grid is going to continue to get worse, right? We're going to lose power in significant things like a Superstorm Sandy or Uri, right? Things like that. They're really catastrophic events that actually people die. Right? We don't just say, oh, power out for a day or two. No, people are dying, right? I mean, what was Uri? Like 120 people died or something like that because of that?
I don't know, but people are going to go down.
Right? And so we're going to have people that are going to be dying. Obviously, we're so impacted by loss of electricity nowadays. I just installed a home solar and battery system because I got 5 outages over the last few years, right? I'm tired of it. Like I need to have availability at my house, right? That wasn't important 10 years ago. Now it is, right? And so as data centers, we definitely need that availability. We need to think about that. How do we really become a player in the market, be part of the solution, not just wait in line and beg for more capacity?
We're just going to go out and find our own place. We're going to build our own stuff, and we're going to wait for someone to come to us.
And we could do that sooner. I can get industrial turbines in as little as 4 months. Right today.
What's an industrial? Right. What qualifies that? Based on volume?
It's really by how it's built. It's really built to be running all out, 8760, right? Have very little maintenance, very high availability. It can really run in almost any fuel.
No
and switch
size,
instantly.
no. It doesn't have to be a minimum size.
No, there's not a size. Believe it or not, we can get industrial turbines down to 3, 4, 5 megawatts, right? Which is really small when you think about like big turbines are 500 megawatts, right? But that's the great thing about turbines they can get this massive broad range and size. Engines, we generally only can get up to about somewhere in that like 30, 40, 50 megawatts, right? More typically around 20, 25 megawatts. But we can get engines all day long in that 20, 25 megawatts, between 10 and 20, right? Those are commonly built, readily available, right? Way more faster, readily available than even we can build the data center, right? And that's my point, is like, if we do this right and we design this right, on-site power doesn't slow us down. It accelerates our path to actually being operational, right? And it can allow us to like provide that net resource to the grid. We can arbitrage that benefit if we want to, but we can at least be a net resource. We can get our capacity up and running, not be an impact to the grid, not be called that power hog, sucking all the power from, whomever else is wanting use of that, right? And I'm not putting anyone down because we all want that electricity.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, I think what's going to be expected from the consumers of technology is a limitless amount of on-demand everything they want. Do you agree? And that is no longer possible. There's a part of the horizon where we can see limitations to that for the first time since we've shifted from cellular minutes to data. And that was when? In the early 90s? When we shifted from minutes to data, or maybe that was in 2000. That was probably
around that time.
Yeah. That was probably 2001, 2002.
Yeah.
When we shifted to data, it was an unlimited, infinite amount of technology that you wanted as a consumer.
Yeah.
All you had to do was be willing to spend money for it. And that's what drove cloud. I mean, cloud is a utility. Data center is a utility.
It also drove all these like online services that we all just cherish. You think about Netflix, they used to mail you a disc, right? And you'd mail it back to them, and all the carbon impact and of mailing a disc back and forth, right? Comparatively to just saying, I come home and I hit a button and in a second or two, it's
instantaneous.
Playing. It's remarkable when you think about these steps we've taken over the last decade or two, and it's all been enabled because of our industry.
But we've done it, but the adoption rate of that emerging technology is not slowing down. And what we are for the first time is seeing is limitations to supply chain scalability, right? So that means we've ran into the part where the utility provider, which was part of the supply chain, is now not as reliable as we used to think. So we had to really go into an adjacent industry that's in orbit around ours. When you started and when I started, you're a little bit different because you were probably negotiating PPAs in the early days. But a lot of us were like, you just put the building online, buddy. We'll take care of the rest, right? And then all of a sudden, hey, can you put the substation online with that? And we started adding those.
Yep.
And now they're going to sell that as a package service where every data center owner operator has to find a solution for self-generation and creating a prime of their own, right?
It's either that or they're going to limit their own ability to grow, right?
Yeah.
Both in speed, but also in locations.
That's a regression of growth. That's not, you know what I'm saying? They're actually...
Sure.
They're going to be essentially offering clients the opportunity to be serviced on outdated technology. That's a full-on regression.
Yeah.
And they could decide that they don't want to do that, but that's a really shitty strategy because the game doesn't change because everyone else is iterating.
And I don't believe the utility is the right provider for on-site power,
I agree
for a whole lot of reasons.
Because they
manage their
capable.
grid. That's right. They do a great job managing a grid, right? And let them do that and continue to do that well. But to manage for one consumer, they don't do that well. And as a matter of fact, another fellow Texan and Seaman here, is Thomas McAndrew, right?
Okay.
CEO of Enchanted Rock, right?
He's been on.
And back in the 2001 timeframe, before the California energy crisis hit, I was speaking at a conference where he happened to be an attendee, and I was saying the grid in California is going to melt down. I was pontificating that it was going to melt down, and I literally called together.
Was he at Enron then? He was in the conference.
He was at Enron then, and literally at that time, I'd set up a meeting with really the CEO of all the biggest technology companies in Silicon Valley, about 25 of them, like IBM and HP and I don't know, a bunch of others at the time. I don't remember them all. And the governor of California and a few of the senators to sit down and say, hey, I think we're going to have a problem. And at Exos Communications, we were such a big, fast-growing company. I could get that attention. And literally on the day of the meeting was the first rolling blackout, where I was sitting him down to say, I think we have a big problem. We need to do something about this before it happens, right? And so I was right in the middle of it. I got pulled into weekly meetings with the governor and trying to guide him and all that stuff, about what to do. And that's a whole nother side story, right? But it was really fascinating to see all that front and center, right? I was 7 people in the room with the governor telling the governor what we think we should do. Now, sadly, he didn't really do what a lot of us told him we should do.
Which governor, by the way?
That was Davis.
Okay.
Who was known as the education governor and became, became the power governor. In a lot of ways, he cared about getting reelected, and that meant not letting the price of electricity rise. And my key point was we have to let the consumer see the price of electricity, or else they'll never curtail their demand.
Yeah.
If they see the price of electricity go up, they'll respond to demand, and we'll manage this without having the new generation transmission.
If they understand it's not infinite.
Giving us time to get that all in line. Yeah.
I got you.
Yeah. So anyways, I am a real passionate. I don't think we have a choice, right? But to do on-site gen, if we do it right and we do it well, we optimize, we can get rid of a lot of the diesel. We can still keep it just as reliable. Like I said, we can put in engines or turbines that can switch to diesel instantly on the fly. So if we're really feared about that natural gas pressure loss, right, we keep running. We keep running on on-site stored diesel just like we have today.
All the reliability to a network topology to where they have like a metroactive replication where they fail over into another building and let that building go down. And does that make sense? It's the only way is to bake reliability at that level. You can't do it at the infrastructure side at the scale that we're going to do it at because we're not even sure what some of these loads are going to look like once they really start.
And think how inefficiently we're managing it today. We have a bunch of 2.5, 2 3/4, 3 megawatt diesel gen sets that always have like some kind of like, 6 to make 5 or, whatever, 5 to make 4 kind of redundancy scheme, whatever, distributed topology or whatever it is, right? And so we have all this inherent redundancy on little tiny blocks. For every 10 megawatts, we really have, call it 13-ish megawatts or so, right? Roughly speaking, right? Or 12 megawatts of really generation. But we only need 10. Yeah. We don't need that additional. It's just sitting there.
No, they're selling it now. They're selling client loads they'll hang additional PDUs on the output of the UPS distribution boards without, with the shunt strip open in case they could protect the 2N loads. And they just be like, look, as long as you're cool with it going down, I'll give you an 8-hour SLA that says I'll put another PDU there.
That's great.
But it's a good way to make it more efficient.
Absolutely more efficient.
And it comes down to the operators. The operators, like the guys at Oracle one time were talking to me, they're like, we look at every data center operator as a stock car. It's really the operations teams that make the difference because there's only so many different types of designs you could find in these things.
That's right.
I think that we're playing, you and I are playing on the operator side when we have comms. Sometimes the enterprise people have a different optics in how they view the problems. And at the same time is the adjacent industries that we're bringing in that are major contributors to our supply chain. And I think that adjacent industry that I was talking about was oil and gas. And oil and gas is now really a part of the product for us now because what it did was it converted a lot of landowners. And what I mean is if you have a shit ton of land and you're like, maybe I even have some capacity that's running along my land or some sort of easement that has pipes on it or something. Yep. But they're like, how valuable is this land that I have now that was once good for farmland and now it could be potentially servicing, it's not in a 500-year, 150-year floodplain. It checks all the boxes. Yep. That land just became something. And you see, like we're inundated. I'm sure you are. There's a ton of developers that are people that are looking for developers to be like, hey, I have this land. And I have access to power.
It's been happening for years. You think about all throughout Kansas and Nebraska and so forth as examples, right? A farmer has to give up, a few little 100 square foot plots to put a wind turbine tower on it and gets $10,000 check every month, right? For that one wind turbine tower for each one that they have. Yeah. And they give up very little of their actual usable land. And sometimes it's even a place where they don't even care because it was like just a little depression or something where it didn't really grow the corn or something very well, right? So think about that. We think about solar, really the ability to put it in a lot of almost like arid, unusable land. I say unusable. Every land's got some use, right? It's got some environmental benefit, but most of it isn't really all that usable. So we can put a lot of solar in some pretty small places or pretty wide open places, but pretty small quantities of it in footprint, right? I know it's much bigger in footprint than anything else, but in places where we don't, it doesn't matter. And now if we can get that load to that generation to the grid, man, we just gained a bunch of free capacity for almost no impact or cost to anybody.
So I want to ask you a couple questions, right? So, because I'm looking at this and we only have I want to get some more out of this. I know that you're speaking of DCAC, but and this podcast will come out after you speak. So you could reference this one. So when you're done, let them know that we went, a little bit more into the paint, trying to understand this one. But let me ask you a couple questions. The first one would be, where do you see the industry going right now with regards to power? What do you see? I know that we're talked about it on a very broad stroke level, but paint with me with some broad stroke or some fine print strokes. Where do you see energy, transforming the industry? Is it in certain markets? Is it, are there certain places that you're going to see are more accretive for other operators to go to because they're deregulated in those energy markets, or there's more capacity for natural gas or solar or wind? What are you seeing? And then I have a question after that one, but what are you predicting that's happening? You analyze and interpret the market trends for the last 5 years with me. What are you seeing happen in the next 5 years with regards to this industry and energy?
Yeah, I don't know if we can just say it's going to be a single answer because it's so dependent on location. Obviously, if we're trying to solve for something in Dublin, it's going to be very different. We're solving for in Poland or Latvia.
Let's talk about the U.S.
Yeah,
right?
we talk about the U.S. Obviously, Loudoun County versus Ohio or.
So what are the differences between those two right now? Obviously, Dominion's turned off power, but Ohio is going to be doing the same.
Yeah, in Dominion, you're either waiting for them to bring their capacity, right, or you're going to go ahead and self-generate. And
how hard is it to get permits in Loudoun County to self-generate?
Having already done it, it's doable.
How many months does it normally take? 3, 6.
It was quicker than getting it didn't stall the data center from getting built. It did not slow its process.
It wasn't critical path or anything.
No, it was not critical path. And so now, granted, this could be different for everywhere, right? And no doubt about it. This is what I talk about when I say optimize power, right? So really think about all those things of space, the footprint, the cost, right? The efficiency of it, all those things. The emissions is a key element, and also how you sell it to your local constituents. But even in Loudoun County, with all the pushback on transmission lines, on-site power is actually considered a more favorable option to some of the Loudoun County commissioners, right? I think we're going to see that continue that trend play out in other places. In Silicon Valley, we have Santa Clara, Silicon Valley Power actually saying, yeah, you know what?
For really?
If you can self-build, great, because we can't bring anything and we'd rather have the tax revenue because we're a municipal
You still have to go through CEQA and all the models that they make in California because you
just have to meet them. That's it.
But that's still like a 15-month model, I'm saying, to be able to.
Yeah, it can be that. That's right.
That's their way. Yeah.
But realize it takes about 18 plus months to build a data center, right? So yeah, you have to take some risk or you have to sit there and wait a little bit, but you're going to wait years before the utility can bring any capacity. So this is very different than, like I said, we're building out in the middle of, Tennessee or Kentucky or something like that, right? So it's very dependent upon the location.
They're building in Mississippi now. Did you see that?
Sure.
Can you do that?
Yeah.
Who would have thought?
Quite frankly, to me, like the job I used to do was do site selections and development of data centers, right? Because I was good at negotiating power deals. And that was one of the key things you needed to obviously develop a data center campus, right? And so that's what I used to do, is development of data centers and campuses. And of course, you're always looking at where the power is and where it's, of course, low cost and lower taxes and all those other things too, right? We're still doing that today, but now we're just looking at for a much bigger quantity of power, right? So there are much more limited locations where we can do that. So we have a lot of people racing to try to find those gigawatt potential campuses, and there's not that many of them.
Where are the better states in the market that are not picked through yet that have, like Kansas is an example? I mean, like there's a lot of places I haven't built data centers in. Some states are just a flyover.
I think it's a lot of the same. It's really going to come down to two things. It's a lot of the same what we were doing a long time ago. We're looking for aluminum smelters and steel mills and paper mills that we're shutting down, where we could say, hey, you got a 50 or 100 meg connection. We can take that because you're shutting down. And we just connect right to your existing substation and build our data center, right? The Dalles, Oregon is a great example of that, where Google really kind of started that. That's right. And so that's one option. The other option is to look where you have really big substations and or obviously other power infrastructure, but substations is really the key thing, but there's not the available load. Because you think about it, if you're going to put a gigawatt load on the end of a transmission line, you can't. A gigawatt load is basically the size of a typical big grids connected power plant. So you can't be all the way at the end of a line, have all these other users along that way, because that transmission line just won't support it, handle it from both the distances and the other demand on it. You pretty much have to be adjacent to that power plant and or right at a major connection point, substation connection point of the grid. I have these massive, big, beautiful power maps. Two of them would cover almost the entire wall that were, behind us here, right? And they're big and beautiful. They show basically every major transmission line, every major substation, every major power plant. They give you all the data on it. They're fantastic. And being so big, you literally walk up to it and you go, okay, here's what that, is. And you can actually, zoom in on it a little bit just from walking up to it and get to where those centers are. So that's where people are looking, but those are limited, right? So again, I think on-site power can be a sole solution or in island mode, or it could also be, of course, combined with the grid, where I said we can now provide power back, and or we can also provide a bridging solution, as you talked about, right, for some interim period that can be really indefinite in time, but also it can now just be augmentative, right? Now we have the grid. Let's just say we have a gigawatt connection for the grid that eventually gets there, but we build a 500 megawatt on-site power system. Now we have 1,500 megawatts of potential power. And obviously we can layer the two in, like you said, also to help gain us availability or reduce availability, sell lower availability, right? That's what's kind of get to it, like Thomas McAndrew of Enchanted Rock is he kind of saw that, like we should be selling power at different levels of availability, right? that's a really difficult business model unless you're doing on-site power. You can't really do it through the grid, so per se, but now when you have on-site power, you can think about those things. And now you said, like you said, you can sell a customer, you want 8 nines, I'll give you 8 nines. You want 2 nines, I'll give you 2 nines, right?
Sure,
I can manage that.
You can. All right, so next question. This is good. Good answer, by the way. Nirvana. Well, look, this is, I love this industry. Regardless of how long we've been around, I feel like we work still amongst the Henry Fords of this industry. Do you agree? I feel like the people that started this whole industry are still among us working.
Yeah, it's really fascinating to know that, right?
Yeah.
Like, yeah. And that is really wonderful. Like this guy ran to the airport. I said, "Oh, say hi to Joe Cava," and it's like, it's nice to be like, "Oh, he works for him." So it's like, okay, great.
Well, he was Exodus too, or was he was Raging Wire or something but he came
Raging
from
Wire. That's right.
He was one of the, all these, big was eating small. There was a consolidation in the market taking place, right? NTT, I think, bought them.
Yeah, NTT bought them. It's right. As a matter of fact, I did a consultant for NTT to help them with that acquisition to kind of analyze. I've done this for a couple of, for firms along the way. Because of that experience, but yeah, no doubt, it's great. Like, Tom Furlong and I still get together and go ski, once a year or something, right? Get together some other times. These people that are there that, are still working and, or, eventually stepping out or soon to step out, I still get together with them and like chat with them and have a good time with them. And that's really fascinating to be able to share those stories. Peter Gross is a great example. I mean, we got stories going back 25 plus years, right?
Peter's one of those Henry Fords, right?
Well, yeah. And the neat thing about our industry is that I asked the Uber driver on the way here today. He asked me what I do. And I said, I'm a power guy in data centers. And I asked him, do you know what data centers are? And he goes, yeah. I go, tell me, what do you think data centers are? And I love this conversation I have with people outside of the industry, because most people say, no, I've heard of them. I don't really know what they are.
Yeah.
Right. Most people say, I don't know. It has something to do with the cloud. Right. And this guy was like, no, I understand. Like it actually makes like this Uber platform, work, and my maps work. And he didn't say it quite that eloquently, but that's effectively who he's communicating. I'm like, that is fantastic. That at least understands that our data centers are providing that kind of a service to him. And to Henry Ford, like to get to that question, like he really established the mass production
and the 40-hour work week,
efficiency, exactly,
and a sub economy that created people that made brakes and tires, like a Michelin now. Who knew that they were going to make tires, and now they determine what the best restaurants are.
Yeah, right? That's right.
But I mean, like,
we're doing that kind of same thing.
I believe that the data center industry has the ability to transform society in a way that powered flight did or the automobile did.
Absolutely. I believe we already have. And I believe we can continue to do it through power and data centers, right? Through the technology and the power, we can now help the grids out. We can make it more cleanly. We can do this transition to renewables. And we can also continue to grow and provide these amazing online services that, like this podcast that we're, people are listening to now, right? That make that available to everybody. It's wonderful.
So Casey, like the reason why I talk about the luminaries, the pioneers that helped blaze these paths, some are with us, some will be us for the next 5 years, some are sunsetting now. And typically what happens is what makes that really healthy for our industry, what made the automotive industry mainstream is when those pioneers retired, and you had the people from Buick and General Motors and Ford and everybody else just go, and they went and they created policy and they became parts of governance, and they did things to work with the government. So the government didn't regulate onto us in a way that stifled the industry, right? And I think that a lot of these people are going to be those types of advisors to whatever level of government that we're going to have at the federal, state, city, county, whatever it is. There's going to be an authority having jurisdiction that's going to want us to standardize on things that we do because of power. And
I also believe because of content, right? And obviously we see those
that's a whole nother
enumerations going on.
That's consumers. They don't have any idea about the power side.
But I really hope you're right. I hope that people in the industry are going to go into, helping to, that's right, with governance and legislation and policy making, because we're going to be needed to make sure that we're being,
they don't kill the industry,
managed in the right way, right? That it's healthy for our industry, it's healthy for the consumer, right? And that we have a net benefit, right?
Once we lock that down, I agree that you're right, though. Other people will come in on the other end and be like, hey, now, do we need to have TikTok on? I mean, do you know how they use TikTok in China? It ain't anything like what we do it here, right? So maybe we need to do a little bit of a better job restricting some of these things ourselves to protect society. But that is only things that happen when you adopt ethics into an industry. Every large mainstream industry that we've already talked about has been around long enough to where they measure the ethics into everything they're doing, and they measure that twice before they execute. We're not at that point. We're in the wild, wild west. We're at year 45 in the electrical industry, before electricity was adopted, and that was the tipping point before everyone started using it. It sat around idle for 45 years, and then on 46th year, people are like, hey, maybe we should all get this. There's a refrigerator that comes with it. Does that make sense? And then all of a sudden, boom, can you imagine a home without electricity? Just like connectivity, the third one, fourth one.
Yep.
But as we are talking in this, I was, a hypothetical, the longest hypothetical on earth. I think I just broke a Guinness record. What I'd like for you to think of is, let's say that's you, and you're the guy that you are the, whoever the administration is, comes in and says, hey, Casey, we need someone to quarterback these data center nerds before they get out of hand. And this is untenable. They're all just asking for gigawatts, and they're all full of shit. So what are we going to do to make sure that we have what they actually need? What do we need to push back on them and be like, hey, listen, do you actually need all these other things too? You know what I'm saying? Broad stroke-ish. But you had the power to solve this problem. What would the problem solve? What would the solution look like if Casey had the idea?
And as I shared, I worked with the Davis administration and then a little bit with the Schwarzenegger administration. I also worked with the Bush administration, Obama administration, helping them really provide guiding principles around power, right? The power grid and how we can make sure we have that power capacity and how to manage that well. The integration of new load and new generation. And I'll gladly do that again. I got involved, John, with Kumi when Congress asked for a report on what are these data centers and all this power they're consuming, right? In 2005 or 4, whatever that was, right? That came out in 2007 or 8, and the different versions of that. We have another version that's going to come out soon. I think that we as an industry need to get involved in that. And if I'm going to be involved in it, I want to make sure that the industry is not thought of as a bad industry, as just a power hog and not providing good benefits back, and that we are really a net contributor to society. We see that in the tax revenues, we see it in the services we provide, all the great jobs, right, that we're providing.
How many people are saved because of the technology that we
provide? Right, exactly. And then also, let's make sure that we're enabling these data centers to continue to do good things, right? And that means we have to make sure we manage our power grid, because no doubt about it, data centers are part of the electrification effort. That's it, right? We think about we are changing from mechanical manufacturing, hard moving, getting in a car and driving a letter, postal mail across the country, deliver it to somebody, to hitting a button to send an email because it bounces through our data centers instantly, right? And that's an electrification effort. That's really fantastic. The value of that to society is tremendous. And I think as generally as society, we've not recognized that, the value that we are providing as an industry, the carbon reductions, right? The reduction in fuel, the efficiency gains, right? And so now I don't want us to be seen as a power hog. I want us to be seen as a contributor, a positive contributor to society, and that let's make sure we're continuing to help data center industry to do the right things and be the right industry. Now, I do think we also, as an industry, we also need to rethink about how we build data centers. We can build data centers exactly the same for 25 years. It's not changed, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the one line's the same, the equipment's the same, it's just a little bit bigger. That's it.
Yeah, that's the part I'm thinking. That's the part I was asking about. I'm like, listen, Casey, what's going to happen? What do you think?
I want to see diesel standby gens go away. Right? I think we can do it far better with obviously a lot cleaner natural gas, but we can also get a lot more value out of that natural gas generator, right? And in some cases, maybe keeping the diesel gens is the right thing to do, but I think that the on-site gen is far better. Like I said, it's the same cost or less in the diesel standby gen.
There's a lot of far better value. The fuel systems, you could go. I mean, I'm with you, but this is not a conversation for that debate. This is one to introduce an exchange. These are the types of things that we want to promote. These ones, and I want to find someone with a big fat brain who's on the other side against you, and have you both go at it over those things. I'm not that guy, by the way, but you need to find someone who can help win that battle.
Sure.
Does that make sense?
I think it'd be fun.
This platform is for those conversations. The only reason why I created a conference, the only reason why I created this was, two reasons. One, to reach the fleet. I want more soldiers, sailors, and airmen to get into this industry. The most advanced weapons, the most advanced technology, the most advanced machines ever created on this earth were first and foremost created for national security. That typically goes in the DoD or the government. And that's why I feel like we should be recruiting more from the government, because those people, they have experience in mission critical environments that's not measured in downtime, it's measured in mortality. So I really love to draw the comparisons of these things, but the platform was to reach them and get them to come here so that they would be more likely to find a job of significance and less likely to harm themselves. But the reality is, the second part is so we can have a greater exchange of ideas, because I don't want to just put on people that all agree to shit. I think that we need to advance the industry, and the only way to do that is to put on people that don't agree. And what will happen is every time I do a podcast, I'll roll shit out, and then someone will disagree with whatever the guest has said, and then I'll get blown up on a few things. I'm like, well, let's have it out then. Because not knowledgeable enough at a level that I have to go to be able to compete with certain people on a subject matter level. But from a broad stroke, I could see, I can report the news from the field and see what the challenges are and where the fears are really at. And the fears come from the limitations of natural gas and really the limitations and reliability from a supply chain perspective all the way to the engine's capabilities.
And if somebody has that fear, boy, look at the electricity transmission system, because that is really
that's different. That's done from a massive scale. We're talking about data center owner operators that are writing 2N SLAs. That product isn't a utility that they're providing as a service. That's a product that they're providing and building and delivering themselves as a service now. So it's a completely different thing, right? So the optics, how they view it, isn't as a certain client of a utility, but as a generator of utility. And that's different because they have to contract to that themselves, right? And that client has liquidated damages.
Sure, but we're already doing it with standby diesel gens, right? We already operate those and run those for a certain number of hours.
Well, we have the diesel gens there to back up in case whatever the turbines go down for utility.
But they don't need to be there for that because we
seems like they do in some markets.
Fuel
and you didn't need those, and why did you get solar and a battery pack for your house, right? You had to do that because you want to be online, right? And you don't rely on the utility. Right, even as an individual
I would not
consumer.
want to rely on electric utility for a data center, but I believe we can do without the standby diesel gens, and I also believe we can modify the designs that we've had to really reduce the cost. And I worked on this a lot with like Yahoo and then Google, not chronologically, but them. Work I did also, for some other of the hyperscalers over the years, and also colo providers. I did a lot of long-term work with Equinix and Digital Realty, right, and helping them really kind of get into the hyperscale space and building a more efficient cost data center. And I think we need to continue that evolution. We really need to work on that, right? Like you mentioned, some customers, you can sell them 2 nines power, fine, great, right? Not all loads need 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 nines, right? And so we should be thinking about that, not homogenizing the design for everywhere, every application.
It's very hybrid.
Yeah, that's right. Create this hybrid model. We can do that in a much more efficient way, both cost, space, right? The utilization of the systems. And, the integration on-site power is just one element of that where we can really make the whole system a lot more efficient. We can get rid of even things like UPSs and those diesel standbys and make it actually just as reliable, if not much.
I agree with all of the things that you're saying. I think that we do it because I believe the technology at the network side is what's going to allow us to maintain certain levels of reliability. I don't have that confidence yet. I want nothing more than natural gas to be the solution or the bridging solution, everything we're doing. I just have a hard time getting to the certain levels of consistency of information that you have immersed yourself in 20 years, right? You've been studying this element of what we do forever. I've been studying it for a year, right? And I'm learning, but I'm not confident yet to say like, yeah, dude, you don't need diesels. I'm not there yet. You're there because you see a little bit different stuff.
I will help you and others to get there, right? And
I don't think I'm alone. There's a lot of people that think like me, right?
Yeah, exactly. I agree with that. And that's part of like my, like I said, passion, right, is to help the industry get better. I've been doing that for my entire time in this industry. Help get better with how we design and build data centers, how we operate them, make them more efficient, right? Obviously, utilization of more clean power. Been doing that, since even before I came in the data center industry. And I'm going to continue to do those things, but I also want to continue to help this really industry grow and evolve. And I'm really worried, right? It's why I'm so passionate right now. Is that I've never been worried in the 25 years I've been in the data center industry for the data center industry. And I'm worried because of the electric grid. And it's not the United States problem. It is a global problem. I've been working in dozens of countries over the last couple of years, worked over my life over 45 countries, right? Working on power solutions and them. And this is really a global challenge that we have.
Power is the biggest thing, right? Power and people and capacity, right? And those are the 3 existential threats to the industry. Sure. So I'm with you. I agree with all this stuff. We have to continue to have these types of conversations. I think that I'm not worried because there's going to be something bad. It's going to happen. There's going to be something bad.
People wake up and hopefully they'll learn from that and make a change and not just think it's just a short-term operation and it's not going to happen again, right?
Yeah. Like you have September 11th to have September 12th. You have bad date. Sadly, this industry, along most things, they don't iterate and improve until there's something that's painful that happens to it.
Forces that change,
right? And I'm actually not scared of it. I'm waiting for that because it's gonna. I believe the change it'll demand from us as consumers will push back up to the companies that we buy our products from. Is we're going to demand that there's a pivot that pivot will be on power. This is the 5th industrial revolution. Every industrial revolution's entire focus has been predicated on power. The 5th is on power too. We just don't know what that looks like yet. But we know that natural gas will be a part of it. We know that solar And wind will be a part
and
of it.
nuclear as well, right? They're all going to be a part of it. Let's hope they're all part of it.
Yeah, I think
they will be. It
I
just matters
agree.
to what extent.
I agree.
Right. And guys like me, I've looked at every one of the SMR companies in depth, right? I've had very long conversation with them. I won't get into details, but I have potential projects moving forward with some. I'm not, anti anything. I think we need all of these solutions, and in the right place, like we create the right solution. But we can't just be, I think, singular minded that this is the only solution, it'll work everywhere, because it's not. Like we have to think about those local permitting regulations, air
so
emissions,
market by
constituency of that market. Yeah, what the market conditions and needs are.
Sure.
The grid's needs, all of those things. But then we think about that, we can create the right solution.
I agree. Let's do, all right, one last question, then we'll bring this one home, because it's been a great podcast, by the way. I really appreciate the exchange, because I hear so much shit that I'm like, what's good, what's bad? And everyone tells me what's good. And I'm like, bullshit. Because the next person I talk to tells me that's bad. So I'm going to scratch the paint, pressure test just about everything. But this should be an easier one for you. Last question. Let's say you are in a backyard somewhere having a grill out, and you're not in an Uber. What do you tell people you do for a living?
I tell them I create power solutions for data centers. And then I wait to see what they do with their eyes, if they understand what data center is, or they kind of have that inquisitive look.
How can you tell if they know, or how many times do they just grin, nod? You'd be like, oh yeah, I get that. And
often they just go, oh, right.
Okay.
Yeah. And then they don't even know what to ask after that, because they really don't understand those two industries, right? We understand a lawyer and an accountant and an engineer, but you start getting a power in data centers, it's like, whoa, no one really understands that stuff, right? Not a lot of people do. And so then I'll dive in. I'll often ask them, well, do you know what a data center is, right? Just like I did with that Uber driver today. And often it's my way of trying to be a good steward for the industry, and also help them understand like this is a really valuable industry, and they're using it every hour of the day.
They touch data centers 20 times a day at least. I just tell them it's the most punk rock industry in the world. Like this industry is going to change the world, right? And
I think it already has.
I think it has, just like electricity has, but it took 46 or 47
for people to
years.
recognize it.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And I think that we're getting to the point where they're prevalent enough, and people are so, cloud's a prevalent enough term. They think they know what that is.
They point sometimes to the sky.
Yes, I've seen that. I've seen that from candidates, right? So my thing is it's out there, it's in the lexicon, and it's a thread that people are going to pull at. And I think that when the election cycle is over, a lot of people are going to really shift their focus back to the thing that has been one of the most exciting yet simultaneously scariest thing for them, is what is AI all about? What's the capabilities and limitations, and how's it going to impact what I do for jobs? Right now, there are every minute 4 kids graduate from college on average a year with a college degree that is now obsolete, because whatever they were studying, it could have been paralegal for all I know. We have ChatGPT legal for that now. We don't need paralegals. You know what I'm saying? There's going to be so many things those jobs are gone, but new jobs are iterated. How about this? Every minute, 2 universities on average have to begin rewriting and redrafting or replacing entirely all of their curriculum for education, because whatever they're teaching in their freshman year is typically going to be obsolete by the time a kid graduates to senior year.
It's evolving rapidly.
So there's so much stuff going on. We're really targeting the 18 to 24-year-olds, because the Gen Zers will, before the end of this year, outnumber the baby boomers in the workforce. So we really need those digital pioneers that have been born with, imagine being born, Casey, where the World Wide Web, the Internet of Things has already existed. Then we gave them smartphones, which took 13 years to adopt, and those came with applications. So we shifted to an application-based technology society, and that led to social media, and now look at where we're at today, right? So just imagine, these are the ones that were born with that. They were like us that were born with fast food, which fast food's we look at fast food like cigarettes now, but think about the generation that turned cigarettes away, right? So it started with generations that, cigarettes are now bad, fast food's now bad. Pretty soon Gen Z is going to be holding their cell phone out and they're going to be like, that's the new cigarette, right?
Yeah.
And we as consumers will use technology in a better way, in a healthier way, a more harmonious way, but not in the same way that we do today. It's going to be incredible, I think. So I'm looking forward to these discussions. Thank you for being a part of this. Thanks for joining the revolution, Casey. And thanks for, if people wanted to reach out to you, how do they connect? You find you on Casey is spelled because
capital K, capital C.
There you go.
And then last name's Mares, Mares. And I am at MegaWattConsulting.com right now, and that's the easiest way to reach me, or on LinkedIn, of course, to that. Yeah, and I've been actually starting a blog series on power and data centers because I've not been able to share a lot what I do because I've been working for companies that I've not been able to share. Yeah, these are highly competitive advantages. I'm not going to share those highly competitive advantages and things that we created, but I am going to share just general concepts, right? That go in a little bit deeper to help people understand, like, some of the different options we can take. And Kirk, I really appreciate you and like what you've done for the industry and what you're continuing to enable to do, and like through this podcast and through the DCAC conference, right? And all the other things that you do, and certainly all the others in our industry that also are enabling so many great things. I'm thrilled to be here and certainly be at the conference. That I'll obviously connect with a lot of friends, a lot of old friends, and that's really wonderful. And I really highly recommend that those of us in the industry, we just continue to collaborate with each other and share knowledge and help each other get better, right? Like we've been doing in the entire time I've been in this industry.
Yeah.
And I think that's our best attribute as data center geeks, is that we care about each other, want each other to be better.
Yeah, we're trying to advance each other.
That's right. And I think if we all do that, we're all going to be better ultimately in the end, right? And I think we just have to keep on that path. And I'm a data center geek too. I mean, I even wore my data center.
Look at that data center. Look at that savage shirt.
That's right. I love the
Leopard.
data center savage.
It's like Def Leppard. I love it. Look at that.
That's right. Yeah. It's
we're
pretty cool.
We're just trying to pull things out to make it more easier. I'm trying to make it something that people could identify with. So I'm using brands that people could identify. Like, who didn't love Def Leppard? Who didn't listen to Pour Some Sugar on Me? You know what I'm saying?
Right.
But if I'm trying to target 18 to 24-year-olds, and I want them to know that they could come here with it, and they could spend their entire career here. And not only that, but they don't need to go to college to do it. They just need to be creative and learn how to work their asses off.
Somehow we need to become more apparent as an industry. And I'll give you an example. When I was actually in the waiting room here just before our podcast recording, I signed up for a webinar on power through, some organization, and it asked what industry you're in. And it, always typically you have a drop down menu.
Never has ours.
Never has our industry or even anything really close. It had high tech. And I was like, okay, I'll select high
Semiconductors.
tech. Sometimes they have energy and power. And I'm like, okay, I'll select that, or energy and utilities. But rarely do they have data centers. And that really saddens me because I feel like we should be a prominent enough industry that we should be standing out. There's a half a million of us work in this industry, if not more.
Give us to the half of next year. By first half of next year, this industry will be a mainstream sport.
Yeah, we're adding $2 trillion to the US GDP a year, like over $2 trillion. That is tremendous.
This is an industry now that will have to have college degrees if people are going to access it.
I hope so.
It's about ready to burst loose and change. So, but listen, man, we ran way over. This has been a great podcast. We could do this for another hour, as you could tell, but I'm looking forward to hearing you speak. This is conference week for us. 1,200 of my closest friends are coming into town to talk about nerd shit. So this is my favorite part of the year, but this is really where I get to learn and be inspired, right? So I appreciate you being on stage. I can't wait to see what the listeners have to say, but make sure you let them know that they could go, we'll go a mile wide and an inch deep on a stage, but you would go an inch wide and a mile deep on this on this podcast. And that's what I intend to do. So be prepared to come back and join the revolution again. Okay.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me here.
Thank you, buddy.
It's always great to spend time with you.
Thanks, Casey. Appreciate it.